You are looking at one particular tree. It is a cacao tree, but it does not look like most trees you have seen before. Its trunk is not tall and straight, reaching for the sky. Instead, it is somewhat short and twisted, covered with rough bark that is a mottled pattern of grey-brown and pale lichen green. The bark has deep vertical fissures and horizontal cracks like the skin of an old elephant. The tree seems to hunch under the taller neighbors that surround it, grateful for their shade. Its leaves are large ovals with pointed tips hanging downward on short stems. They are a dark, glossy green on top and a paler matte green underneath. When you look closely, you can see the delicate pattern of veins running through each leaf, a fine network that carries water up from the roots and sends sugar back down to feed the trunk. The most unusual thing about this tree is where the fruit grows. On most fruit trees, the fruit hangs from the tips of slender branches out where the sun can reach it. But here on the cacao tree, the pods emerge directly from the trunk and the thickest limbs. They look like strange ornaments attached without visible stems, their smooth, waxy skin pressed right against the rough bark. This is a quiet adaptation to a forest life where branches are too weak to bear heavy weight and where reaching up into the wind might mean breaking. The tree keeps its future close to its heart. You stand here for a long time. Time moves differently in this grove. It is measured not in minutes or hours, but in the slow accumulation of moisture on a leaf tip before it finally releases a single drop that falls to the leaf below with a soft tap and then slides off into the dark soil. It is measured in the imperceptible growth of a small green bump on the side of the trunk. That bump is where your attention settles. It is a cacao flower bud, not much larger than a grain of rice. The tree produces thousands of these tiny waxy flowers over the course of a year, most of which will never become fruit. They appear in clusters, a pale pinkish white against the dark bark, looking delicate and almost out of place. They have no noticeable scent to a human nose. Those small midges and tiny insects find them easily enough drawn by something we cannot detect. The flowers open slowly over several days, 5 slender petals curving back to reveal a small center. Then they wither and turn brown and drop to the forest floor, where they become part of the soft, damp litter that feeds the roots. But one flower is different. Out of thousands, perhaps 1 in 100, will be visited by the right combination of tiny flying things, at the right moment when the air is just moist enough and the temperature just steady enough. You cannot see this happen. It is too small, too quiet. All you can see over the passing of many days is that one small bump at the base of the spent flower does not shrivel and fall away. It remains. It begins to swell. This is the beginning of the pod. For a long time, it looks like nothing more than a tiny green nub, a slight swelling in the bark where the flower once was. You might mistake it for a new leaf bud if you were not watching so carefully. The forest around it continues its slow breathing. Water drips from high leaves after a night of mist. A line of ants marches up the trunk and back down again, following a scent trail invisible to you. They pass over the small swelling without pausing. They have their own work to do, carrying bits of leaf and tiny seeds to their underground home. The pod grows. It does so with a patience that is almost impossible for a human mind to truly comprehend. If you were to leave this spot and return after a month had passed, you would see that the noob has become a small green oval about the length of your thumb. Its surface is smooth and slightly glossy, with faint ridges running from the point where it attaches to the trunk to the rounded tip. The color is a fresh bright green, the color of new spring leaves in a northern forest. Though there is no spring here, only a continuous cycle of wet and slightly less wet. You watch it over many more weeks. The pod swells slowly. The green deepens. The ridges become more pronounced. It takes on the shape of a small pointed football or a large almond, only it is attached at the wider end. The weight of it pulls slightly downward, but the attachment is strong, fibrous, and designed to hold fast through storms and passing animals. The tree feeds it constantly through the intricate plumbing that runs just under the bark. Sugars created in the leaves high above travel down through the inner layer of the trunk to this one growing point. Minerals drawn up from the deep soil by the sprawling network of roots make their way upward. The pod is a sink, a quiet gathering place for the energy of the forest. Seasons pass in a blur of humidity and brief afternoon showers. The grove is never truly dry. Even on days without rain, the air holds so much water that your skin would feel damp and your clothes would cling to you. This is the home the cacao tree prefers, a place where the soil is always cool to the touch and the air is a blanket. The sound of the forest is a constant low hum. There is the distant chatter of birds hidden in the high canopy, their calls echoing and overlapping. There is the rhythmic buzz of cicadas that rises and falls in waves like the sound of the sea, only made of insect wings. There is the occasional rustle of a lizard darting across dry leaves on the ground. All these sounds blend together into a single steady drone that fills your ears and leaves no room for sharp silence or sudden noise. The pod continues to change. The green of its skin begins to shift. It is a subtle change at first, just a hint of yellow appearing near the base where it meets the trunk. Over many days this yellow spreads and deepens into a warm golden hue. Then streaks of red begin to appear, as if the pod is slowly ripening from the inside out. The red starts along the prominent ridges and seeps into the valleys between them. Eventually the entire pod is a deep, rich red-brown, the color of old leather or dried blood. It is beautiful in a quiet, understated way, hanging there against the gray, rough bark. The surface of the ripe pod is waxy and firm. If you were to reach out and touch it, which you do not, because you are only watching, you would find that it gives very slightly under pressure, like a firm avocado. The skin is thick, perhaps a quarter of an inch, designed to protect the precious contents inside from insects and from the beaks of curious birds. The pod has been growing for nearly 6 months. It has weathered brief gusts of wind that shook the whole tree and sent leaves spinning down. It has been pelted by heavy rain that ran down its smooth sides and rivulets. It has been passed over by a family of small monkeys moving through the canopy who paused to look at it, but found it not yet ready to eat. The thick skin protected it from all of these things. Inside the pod, something else is happening. You cannot see it, but you can imagine it. The interior is divided into 5 chambers arranged like the spokes of a wheel around a central core. Each chamber is lined with a soft white pulp that is moist and sweet-smelling, faintly like a floral lemonade. Nestled within this pulp are the beans. There are 30 to 40 beans in a pod of this size, each one shaped like a flattened almond, and each one covered in a thin, papery shell. At this stage the beans are pale purple or lavender in color, and they are bitter and astringent to the taste. They are not yet chocolate. They are only the potential for chocolate waiting. The tree holds the ripe pod patiently. There is no hurry in this forest. The pod will hang there until the precise moment when the tiny fibers that connect it to the trunk decide to loosen. This might be triggered by a slight change in humidity, or by the internal pressure of the ripened fruit, or simply by the accumulated weight of time. You stand and watch and wait. The light shifts as the sun makes its slow arc across the sky, hidden from direct view by the canopy. The shadows on the forest floor lengthen and then soften into a uniform dusk. In the evening, the sounds of the forest change. The day birds settle and fall quiet. A new chorus begins, the high chirping of tree frogs and the steady thrumming of night insects. A bat flutters silently overhead, visible only as a brief darker shape against the already dark sky, visible through gaps in the leaves. The air cools by a degree or two, just enough to notice. Moisture condenses on the broad leaves and drips down to the waiting roots. The pod on the trunk is just a silhouette, now a slightly darker oval against the dark bark. It hangs there through the night undisturbed. Morning comes with a gradual brightening of the greenish light. Mist rises from the damp ground, curling around the trunks of the trees like slow-moving breath. The first birds begin their tentative calls, testing the quiet before the full chorus begins. A small stream somewhere nearby adds its own quiet note, a soft, continuous gurgle over smooth stones. The pod is still there, unchanged from the night before. It looks the same as it did yesterday and the day before. The only difference is that the stem where it attaches is perhaps a fraction thinner, the fibers a tiny bit more brittle. The process of release is underway, but it is a process measured in days, not hours. You have been standing here for what feels like a very long time, though time has lost its usual meaning. You have watched the slow growth of this pod from a microscopic bud to a full ripe fruit the size of a small melon. You have seen the play of light and shadow across its surface. You have heard the endless quiet music of the forest around it. You have felt the weight of the humid air and the steady, patient pulse of life in this ancient grove. The pod is ready. It has completed the first part of its long journey, the journey from flower to fruit. All it needs now is the final, gentle nudge that will separate it from the tree and let it fall into the soft, waiting leaves below. That moment is coming, but not yet. For now there is only the shade of the mother tree and the quiet stillness of a forest that has never known hurry. The air settles. A single leaf high above completes its long, slow fall and lands softly on the forest floor near the base of the trunk. The pod hangs motionless. The grove breathes in and out, and you continue to watch, simply present, in the calm, unbroken quiet of this place, where a bean that will one day travel across an ocean is still just a seed, sleeping in its dark red shell. The pod has been hanging on the trunk for a very long time. You've watched it grow from a tiny green nub into a full, ripe fruit, the color of dark red leather. The stem that connects it to the bark has been slowly drying and thinning, a process so gradual that you could not see it happening moment by moment, only in the accumulated change of many days. Now the connection is no thicker than a pencil lead, a narrow, fibrous thread that holds the weight of the pod against the constant pull of the earth. The tree has done its work feeding the seeds inside and surrounding them with sweet, white pulp. It has given all it can give. The rest belongs to gravity and to time. There is no wind this morning. The air in the grove is perfectly still, a heavy blanket of humidity that muffles sound and slows movement. The leaves overhead hang motionless, their broad surfaces coated with a fine film of overnight moisture. The forest is in that quiet pause between the last notes of the night insects and the first full calls of the day birds. Everything seems to be waiting. Even the ants that usually march in steady lines up and down the trunk are absent, perhaps sheltering from the damp somewhere underground. The pod hangs alone against the rough bark, its smooth, waxy surface catching the faint green light that filters down through the canopy. And then something shifts. It is not a sound you can hear, but a change in the balance of forces, so small that it registers only as a feeling in the air. The last fibers in that slender stem have given way after holding firm for half a year of rain and sun and the gentle swaying of the tree in distant storms. The pod does not crash to the ground. It simply releases from the trunk and drops a distance of no more than a few handspans into the soft cushion of broad wet leaves that have accumulated at the base of the tree. There is a soft, settling sound. The kind of sound a heavy book might make if you laid it down gently on a pillow. The leaves rustle faintly and then fall still. The pod has arrived at the forest floor. You look down at it now. It rests on its side among the dark, decaying leaf litter, its rich red-brown skin contrasting with the muted browns and greys of the fallen foliage around it. A small beetle scurries away from the disturbance, its shiny black carapace disappearing under a curled, dead leaf. The pod is heavy with moisture and pulp, perhaps weighing as much as a small melon. Its waxy skin shows a few tiny scratches from the short fall marks that will heal over or fade as the skin begins its own slow process of decay. But that is for later. Right now, the pod is intact, its thick rind still protecting the delicate contents within. Time passes as it always does in this grove. The light shifts slightly as the sun climbs higher behind the cloud cover. The mist that clung to the ground begins to thin and rise, turning into a faint haze that softens the outlines of the trees. The pod lies undisturbed. It is warm from the ambient heat of the forest floor and from the internal warmth of its own ripening pulp. Inside the 5 chambers that you cannot see, the beans are still nestled in their beds of white mucilage, each one a pale purple seed wrapped in a thin, papery shell. The pulp is sweet and slightly tangy, a natural bait designed by the long, slow process of evolution to attract the creatures of the forest who will break open the pod and carry the beans away. But no creature comes right away. The pod waits. It waits through the slow arc of the morning and into the hazy stillness of midday when the heat rises and the forest grows quiet, even the birds falling silent to conserve energy. It waits through a brief afternoon shower, a sudden patter of fat raindrops that penetrate the canopy and drum against the waxy skin before running down to soak into the leaf litter. The pod glistens with moisture for a while, then dries again as the shower passes and the humidity returns to its normal heavy state. Eventually, the skin of the pod begins to change. You have been watching long enough to notice a slight softening of the waxy surface, a subtle dulling of the rich red color. The pod is beginning to ferment from the inside out, a natural process that starts as soon as the fruit is separated from the tree. The sugars in the white pulp are already starting to break down, converted by natural yeasts and bacteria that live on the surface of the pod and in the air around it. This is the beginning of the transformation that will one day turn these bitter purple seeds into something that people on the other side of an ocean will crave. But that future is far away, unimaginable from this quiet spot on the forest floor. The skin continues to soften over the passing of a day and then another day. You watch as a small crack appears near the pointed end of the pod. It is a hairline fracture barely visible against the dark red surface. It might have been caused by the impact of the fall, or by the internal pressure of the fermenting pulp, or simply by the natural process of the fruit preparing to release its seeds. The crack widens slowly over several hours, not with any sound but with a silent passing of the thick rind. A tiny amount of clear liquid seeps out, a watery juice that smells faintly of sweet wine and wet earth. It trickles down the side of the pod and soaks into the leaf below, leaving a small dark stain. Now the process accelerates slightly, though it is still slow by any human measure. The crack runs along one of the natural ridges of the pod, following a line of weakness that was built into the fruit from the very beginning. The rind splits open along this line, peeling back to reveal the interior. What you see inside is a shock of white against the dark red of the outer skin and the brown of the forest floor. The white pulp is thick and fibrous looking, almost like a dense spider web, or the pith inside a citrus peel, only much more substantial. It lines the 5 chambers of the pod, holding the beans in place, like soft white cushions. The smell that rises from the opened pod is complex and unexpected. It does not smell like chocolate. That will come much later, after fire and stone and sugar. What you smell now is a bright floral scent reminiscent of gardenias or honeysuckle, combined with the clean sharpness of lemon peel and an underlying earthy note that speaks of the soil and the rain and the decaying leaves all around. It is a fresh smell, a living smell that seems out of place in the dim, humid stillness of the grove. If you were a monkey or a rodent or a bird, this smell would draw you in, promising a feast of sweet energy. You lean closer in your mind's eye, examining the interior of the pod. The white pulp is glossy with moisture, and it clings to the beans in thick clumps. The beans themselves are arranged neatly in rows within each chamber, pressed together like sardines in a tin. Each bean is about the size of a flattened almond or a small lima bean. Its shape an irregular oval with a slight point at one end. The color of the fresh bean is a pale lavender purple, a shade that looks almost artificial against the stark white of the pulp. This purple color comes from compounds called anthocyanins, the same pigments that give blueberries and red cabbage their hues. It is a sign that the bean is alive, that the embryo inside is still viable and ready to grow into a new tree if conditions are right. But conditions here on the forest floor are not right for germination. The beans are packed too tightly inside the pod, and they are surrounded by a pulp that inhibits sprouting. The tree has designed its fruit to be eaten by an animal. The animal will consume the sweet pulp and swallow the beans whole. The beans will pass through the animal's digestive tract and be deposited far from the parent tree, wrapped in a package of natural fertilizer. That is the plan, the ancient arrangement between the cacao tree and the creatures of the forest. But this particular pod has fallen before an animal could find it. The pulp will ferment here on the ground, and the beans will either rot or be discovered by something else, perhaps a different kind of animal, one that walks on 2 legs and has learned to value these bitter seeds for reasons the tree could never have imagined. A small ant finds the opening in the pod. It is a tiny black ant, one of the millions that live in the soil and the leaf litter. It crawls over the edge of the split rind and onto the white pulp, its antennae waving as it tastes the air. The sweetness of the pulp must register immediately, because the ant begins to move with more purpose, exploring the sticky surface and eventually returning to the edge of the pod. It disappears down the side, and within a few minutes a thin line of ants is marching up the side of the pod and into the opening, each one pausing to gather a tiny droplet of the sweet liquid before turning and carrying it back to the colony. The ants will work for hours, coming and going in a steady stream. They do not harm the beans. They are only interested in the sugar. You watch the ants for a while. Their movement is hypnotic, a continuous flow of tiny black bodies against the white pulp and the red rind. The line wavers slightly as individual ants navigate around obstacles, a fallen leaf fragment, a drop of moisture, but it never breaks. The ants are patient and determined, carrying out their task with a quiet efficiency that matches the slow rhythm of the forest. They will take some of the pulp, but they cannot take it all. Most of it will remain clinging to the beans, fermenting slowly in the humid air. The fermentation continues. Over the next day, the white pulp begins to change color, shifting from pure white to a creamy ivory, and then to a pale tan. The sweet floral smell intensifies, at first becoming almost cloying, and then it shifts towards something sharper and more acidic, like vinegar or sourdough starter. This is the work of the yeasts and bacteria, converting the sugars into alcohol and then into acetic acid. The temperature inside the pod rises slightly, a small pocket of warmth in the cool damp of the forest floor. You can almost feel the heat if you imagine your hand hovering just above the split rind. The beans themselves are changing too, though you cannot see it yet. The heat and the acid are beginning to break down the bitter compounds inside the seeds, starting the long chemical process that will eventually create the precursors of chocolate flavor. A small rain falls during the night, a soft, steady drizzle that patters against the leaves overhead and drips down through the canopy in 1,000 small streams. The water finds the opening in the pod and mixes with the fermenting pulp, creating a thin brownish liquid that runs out and soaks into the ground. This liquid carries with it some of the yeasts and bacteria, spreading them into the soil, where they will help break down the fallen leaves and return their nutrients to the roots of the trees. Nothing is wasted in this forest. Everything cycles back. By the time the morning light returns, the pulp has shrunk noticeably. It has lost much of its moisture and its volume. The beans are more visible now, their pale purple shapes emerging from the thinning white matrix that holds them. They are still firmly attached to the central core of the pod, but the pulp that once glued them in place is dissolving into a thin, sticky film. The smell has mellowed, losing its sharp, vinegary edge and settling into something earthier and more subdued. The ants have moved on, finding a new source of sugar somewhere else in the grove. A small fly lands on the edge of the rind, walks a few steps, and then flies away again, unimpressed. The pod sits open and quiet for another day. The beans are exposed to the air now, their thin papery shells drying slightly in the humid atmosphere. The purple color of the beans has begun to fade, a little bleaching toward a dull brownish lavender. This is the beginning of the death of the seed. The embryo inside each bean is succumbing to the heat and the acid and the exposure. It will never grow into a new cacao tree. Its destiny lies elsewhere, in the hands of people who will learn to unlock the complex flavors hidden inside these pale, bitter seeds. A shadow falls across the pod. Something has moved between the pod and the diffuse light from the canopy. You look up, or you imagine looking up, and you see a human figure standing at the edge of the grove. The figure is still and quiet, wearing simple clothing made of woven fibers, the color of the earth. This is a person who knows this forest well, who walks these paths every day looking for ripe pods among the many trees that grow here. The person carries a simple woven bag over one shoulder, and in one hand, a small wooden tool for cutting stems. They have been watching the pod from a distance, waiting for it to fall and split on its own, knowing that the pulp will have fermented just enough to make the beans easier to remove. The person approaches slowly, their bare feet making almost no sound on the soft, wet leaves. They crouch beside the pod and examine it with calm, patient eyes. They note the color of the pulp, the degree of fermentation, the condition of the beans. This is a practiced assessment made by someone who has done this many times before. Satisfied, they reach into the pod with careful fingers and begin to scoop out the beans and the remaining pulp. The beans come away easily, sliding out of their chambers with a soft, wet sound. They are placed into a small gourd or a clay bowl that the person has brought for this purpose. The work is slow and methodical. There is no rush. The forest around them continues its quiet business, while they gather the beans one handful at a time. The empty pod remains on the ground, a hollow shell of red-brown skin that will slowly decay over the coming weeks, feeding the soil and the worms and the fungi. Its work is done. The beans are now separated from the tree that grew them, beginning a new phase of their long journey. They rest in the clay bowl, a wet, sticky mass of purple seeds and clinging white pulp looking nothing like the dry brown beans that will one day cross an ocean. The person rises to their feet, brushes the damp leaves from their knees, and walks away through the trees, disappearing into the green shadows as quietly as they arrived. The grove returns to its stillness. The empty pod lies where it fell, its split sides, slowly curling inward as it dries. A small mushroom will sprout from the decaying rind in a few days, a pale white cap pushing up through the dark leaf litter. The ants will find other tasks. The tree will continue to produce new flowers, tiny pinkish-white stars against the rough bark, and some of them will become new pods to replace the one that was taken. The cycle goes on unhurried and undisturbed, and somewhere not far away, the beans are being carried to a place where they will be piled together under broad green leaves and left to sweat in the warmth of the sun, beginning the next slow transformation that will eventually turn them into something entirely new. The beans have been gathered into a clay bowl and carried a short distance through the dappled shade of the forest. They rest now in a shallow depression in the earth, lined with broad green banana leaves that overlap like the scales of a fish. The leaves are still fresh, having been cut only this morning, and they release a faint green smell when they are touched, to smell like cut grass and rainwater. The beans are piled in the center of this leafy nest, a wet clump of pale purple seeds, still coated with the sticky remnants of the white pulp that once held them inside the pod. They glisten faintly in the dim light, their surfaces catching the few rays of sun that manage to filter down through the high canopy. The person who carried them here has covered the pile with more banana leaves, folding them carefully over the top and tucking the edges under the sides so that the beans are completely enclosed. This is a simple structure, little more than a heap of organic matter on the forest floor, but inside this pile a profound change is about to begin. The beans are about to sweat. You watch the pile from a short distance away. It looks like nothing more than a mound of leaves, a small irregular shape on the ground that might be mistaken for a fallen branch or a cluster of new growth. The edges of the leaves flutter slightly in a passing breath of air and then fall still. The forest around the pile continues its quiet routine. A bird calls from somewhere high up in the canopy its song, a series of descending notes that fade into silence. Water drips from a broad leaf onto another leaf with a soft tap. The pile sits undisturbed. Inside the leaf wrapping, the temperature is already beginning to rise. This is the first effect of the fermentation process. The sugars in the clinging white pulp are being consumed by tiny living things, yeasts and bacteria that exist naturally on the surface of the beans and in the air of the forest. These microorganisms are invisible to your eyes, but they are working, constantly breaking down the complex carbohydrates into simpler compounds and releasing energy in the form of heat. The heat is slight at first, just a faint warmth that you could barely detect if you were to press your hand against the leaves, but it will grow over the coming hours and days. The pulp begins to liquefy. You cannot see this happening beneath the leaves, but you can imagine it. The white mucilage that once held the beans together in neat rows inside the pod is now dissolving into a thin, watery liquid. This liquid is sweet and slightly acidic, carrying with it the yeasts and bacteria that are driving the fermentation. It trickles down through the pile, wetting the beans at the bottom and then slowly draining away into the soil below. The ground under the pile becomes damp and dark, absorbing the sugary runoff. Small insects in the soil may be drawn to this sweetness, but they cannot reach the beans themselves, which are protected by the leaf wrapping and by the heat building inside. The heat increases. After several hours, the interior of the pile is noticeably warmer than the surrounding air. The yeasts are multiplying rapidly, feeding on the abundant sugar and producing alcohol as a byproduct of their metabolism. This is the same process that turns grape juice into wine or barley mash into beer, only here it happens in a pile of leaves on the forest floor. The alcohol content rises slightly, and then the bacteria take over. Acetic acid bacteria convert the alcohol into acetic acid, the compound that gives vinegar its sharp taste and smell. The pile begins to emit a faint vinegary odor that seeps out through the gaps in the leaf wrapping and mingles with the earthy scent of the forest. You notice the smell if you imagine standing nearby. It is not unpleasant, just unexpected. The sweet floral notes that rose from the freshly opened pod have faded, replaced by something sharper and more complex. There is still a hint of fruitiness underneath the vinegar, a ghost of the ripe pulp's original perfume. and beneath that there is the beginning of something else. A deeper, earthier note that hints at the flavors to come. This is the smell of transformation, the smell of one thing becoming another. The beans inside the pile are changing too. The heat and the acid are working on the pale purple seeds, penetrating through their thin papery shells and into the cotyledons, the fleshy storage leaves that make up most of the bean's interior. The purple anthocyanin pigments that gave the fresh beans their distinctive color are breaking down. The cells that contain them are rupturing, spilling their contents into the surrounding tissue. The beans begin to lose their purple hue, shifting toward a muddy brown. This is the first visible sign of the death of the seed. The embryo inside each bean can no longer survive in this hot, acidic environment. It perishes quietly, releasing enzymes that begin to break down the bitter compounds and the complex proteins stored in the cotyledons. This is the crucial step, the reason why the beans must sweat. Without this fermentation, the beans would remain bitter and astringent, full of compounds that make them unpalatable. The heat and the acid and the enzymes work together to transform those bitter compounds into something else, something that will later be coaxed out by roasting and grinding. It is a slow alchemy that cannot be rushed. The beans must sit in their own heat for days, allowing the chemistry to run its course. The pile is turned. You watch as the person who built the leaf wrapping returns after a full day has passed. They crouch beside the pile and carefully unfold the top layer of leaves, exposing the steaming mass of beans within. A puff of warm air rises from the pile, carrying that complex vinegary, fruity smell. The beans look different than they did when they were first piled here. They've darkened noticeably, shifting from pale purple to a rich brown, the color of wet earth or old wood. The pulp that clung to them has mostly dissolved, leaving only a thin, sticky film on the surfaces. The beans are clumped together, their warm, wet shells sticking to one another. The person reaches into the pile with both hands and begins to turn the beans. This is a gentle process, a slow mixing that brings the beans from the bottom to the top and the ones from the edges to the center. The purpose is to ensure that all the beans experience the same conditions, the same heat, and the same exposure to the fermenting pulp. The beans that were at the cool edges of the pile are moved into the warm center where the temperature is highest. The beans that were in the hottest part of the center are moved to the edges to cool slightly. The person works with a calm rhythm, their hands moving through the warm, sticky mass without hurry. The sound is a soft, wet rustling like stirring a thick porridge. When the turning is finished, the beans are piled up again and covered with fresh banana leaves. The old leaves, which have wilted and browned from the heat, are set aside to decompose. The new leaves are bright green and pliable, sealing the pile once more. The fermentation resumes. The temperature, which had dropped slightly during the turning, begins to climb again as the yeasts and bacteria find new sources of sugar in the redistributed pulp. The pile settles into a steady state, a warm, humid microclimate nestled in the cool damp of the forest. You watch the pile through the second day. The sun moves across the sky, hidden behind the layers of leaves. The light that reaches the forest floor is green and diffuse, shifting slowly as the hours pass. A butterfly passes through a patch of sunlight near the pile, its wings a flash of bright blue against the muted greens and browns. It circles once and then disappears into the shadows. The pile steams gently, a faint wisp of vapor rising from the gaps between the leaves when the air is cool enough to condense the warm, moist air from inside. The vinegary smell continues to waft out, carried on the slight currents that move through the grove. A small lizard basks on a fallen log nearby, its throat pulsing with each breath, but it pays no attention to the pile. Inside the leaf wrapping, the chemistry continues. The acetic acid concentration is reaching its peak. The beans are now thoroughly acidified, a condition that helps preserve them and prevents the growth of unwanted mold or bacteria. The bitter alkaloids in the beans are being broken down into simpler molecules, some of which will later contribute to the complex flavor of chocolate. Proteins are being chopped into amino acids and short peptides by the enzymes released from the dying cells. These amino acids and peptides will later react with sugars during roasting to create hundreds of new flavor compounds through a process called the Maillard reaction. But all of that is still in the future. Right now, the beans are simply sitting in their own warmth, undergoing a quiet chemical transformation that has been practiced in this forest for countless generations. The pile is turned again on the second day. The person returns at the same time as before, their movements unhurried and familiar. They peel back the wilted leaves, and the warm smell rises up to meet them. The beans are darker now, a uniform brown with hints of red and purple still visible on some of the wetter surfaces. The sticky film that coated them has dried slightly, leaving them with a slightly tacky feel. The person mixes them again, their hands moving through the pile in a slow circular motion. The beans rustle softly as they are turned. A few fall to the side and are carefully gathered back into the center. The new leaves are laid over the top, and the pile is left to sweat for another day. The third day arrives with a light rain. You hear it before you see it. A soft pattering on the leaves high above that grows steadily louder. The drops that penetrate the canopy are few at first, and then more frequent, falling in a random pattern on the forest floor. Some of them land on the leaf wrapping of the pile and bead up on the waxy surface before rolling off to soak into the ground. The pile itself is protected from the rain by its leafy cover, but the moisture in the air increases and the humidity inside the pile remains high. The fermentation continues undisturbed, the microorganisms doing their quiet work regardless of the weather above. By the end of the third day, the smell from the pile has begun to change again. The sharp vinegary note is fading, replaced by something rounder and more mellow. There is a hint of something nutty, a suggestion of toasted grain or roasted nuts. And there is a deepening earthy quality, a smell like rich soil after a rain. The fruitiness is almost gone now, just a faint echo underneath the other notes. This is the smell of properly fermented cocoa, the smell that tells the person tending the pile that the process is nearly complete. The pile is turned one more time on the fourth day. The beans have darkened further, reaching a deep brown color that is almost uniform across the entire batch. They have lost most of their external moisture, and they no longer stick together in clumps. Each bean feels separate and slightly springy to the touch, its papery shell still intact, but now loosened from the cotyledon inside. The person examines a handful of beans, holding them up to the light that filters through the canopy. They note the color, the texture, the smell. All of these signs indicate that the fermentation has run its course. The beans are ready for the next step. The person does not pile the beans again. Instead, they spread them out on a fresh layer of banana leaves, exposing them to the open air for the first time since they were sealed inside the pod. The beans lie in a single layer, their wet brown surfaces glistening faintly. The heat that has been building inside the pile for 4 days begins to dissipate, rising into the humid forest air. The smell of fermentation lingers, but it is softer now, more subdued. The beans are still warm to the touch, a residual warmth that will fade over the next few hours as they cool to the ambient temperature. You watch the beans resting on the leaves. They look small and unremarkable, just a pile of wet brown seeds on a green mat. But they have already traveled far from their origin as pale purple kernels hidden inside a red pod on a rough-barked tree. They have been fermented, transformed by the invisible work of tiny living things. They have been turned and tended and watched over with quiet patience, and they are not yet finished. The next step will require the sun and the open air and more time. The beans will need to dry slowly, losing the moisture that still fills their cells until they are hard and stable and ready to be stored or transported. But that is for another day. For now, they simply rest on the green leaves, cooling in the soft light of the forest, while the person who has been tending them sits nearby, watching the same slow dance of shadows and light that has been playing across this grove for longer than anyone can remember. The pile of spent leaves that was removed during the turnings lies nearby, a small mound of wilted brown vegetation. Already the edges of the leaves are beginning to curl and darken as they decompose. Small insects explore the decaying matter, finding nourishment in the sugars and fibers that remain. Within a few weeks, these leaves will have broken down, completely becoming part of the dark, rich soil that feeds the roots of the cacao trees and the other plants of the forest. The cycle continues. The beans that were once part of the tree are now separate, beginning their own journey, and the tree itself is already producing new flowers, new pods, new seeds that will someday follow the same path from branch to ground, to pile to sun. The light begins to fade as the afternoon wears on. The greenish glow that fills the grove takes on a golden tint as the sun drops lower in the sky, though it is still hidden by the canopy. The shadows under the trees deepen and merge into a uniform dusk. The beans on their bed of leaves grow darker too. their wet surfaces no longer catching the faint light. The person rises slowly, brushes the bits of leaf and soil from their clothing and walks away into the trees, leaving the beans to rest. They will return in the morning to check on the drying process, but for now there is only the quiet of the forest and the slow cooling of the beans and the endless patient turning of the earth. The beans lie spread out on a broad flat surface. This surface is made of woven palm fronds laid over a frame of smooth wooden poles, raised slightly above the ground so that air can circulate underneath. The mat is large, perhaps the size of a small room, and it sits in an open area where the forest has been cleared back just enough to let the sun reach the earth. Around the edges of this clearing, the tall trees still stand, their dark green leaves forming a wall of shade that encroaches on the bright center. The mat is positioned to catch the maximum amount of sunlight as the sun moves across the sky from morning to evening. The beans are no longer wet and sticky. They have been rinsed briefly in clear water to remove the last traces of the fermented pulp, and now they lie in a single layer across the woven surface, each bean separate from its neighbors. There are many hundreds of them, perhaps thousands, covering the mat in a dense carpet of brown. The color is not yet the deep dark brown of finished cocoa. It is a lighter shade, a reddish brown, like the skin of a chestnut or the bark of a young tree. The beans are still plump, with internal moisture, and their papery shells are soft and slightly loose to the touch. You stand at the edge of the clearing, in the shade of the surrounding trees, and you watch the mat. The morning sun has just climbed high enough to clear the eastern canopy, and its light falls directly onto the beans for the first time today. The effect is immediate though subtle. The beans seem to warm visibly, their surfaces taking on a slight sheen as the moisture inside them begins to respond to the heat. A faint wisp of steam rises from the mat, a barely visible haze that shimmers in the sunlight before dissipating into the air. This is the water leaving the beans, the first slow exhalation of a process that will take many days. The sun moves higher, its light grows stronger, and the temperature on the mat rises steadily. The beans absorb this heat without complaint. They have been through the warmth of the fermentation pile and they are accustomed to being warmed. But this is a different kind of warmth, a dry, radiant heat that penetrates into the cotyledons and coaxes the water molecules to break free from the cells that hold them. The water rises to the surface of each bean and evaporates into the dry air, passing into the atmosphere and drifting away on the slight breeze that moves through the clearing. The beans lose a tiny fraction of their weight with each passing minute, a loss so small that it cannot be measured except in the accumulated change of hours. You watch the mat for a long time. The sun climbs to its highest point directly overhead, and the shadows of the surrounding trees shrink to thin dark lines at the base of the trunks. The light is brightest now, a white gold glare that makes the beans look almost pale. The heat is intense but not unbearable, a steady warmth that you can feel on your imagined skin if you step out of the shade. The beans lie motionless under this light. They do not move or shift. The only sign of change is the continuing faint shimmer of heat above the mat, a distortion in the air that makes the edges of the beans waver slightly when you look at them from a distance. A cloud passes over the sun. It is a large white cloud, one of the many that drift across the tropical sky in the afternoon, driven by the trade winds high above. Its shadow sweeps across the clearing and falls over the mat, bringing a sudden coolness. The temperature drops by several degrees in an instant, and the shimmering heat haze disappears. The beans seem to relax though. Of course they are not alive in that way. The rate of evaporation slows as the air around them cools, and the moisture inside them pauses in its journey outward. The shadow lingers for a few minutes, and then the cloud moves on. The sun returns, and the warmth resumes its work. This pattern repeats throughout the afternoon. Clouds come and go, each one bringing a brief respite of cool shade. The beans are alternately warmed and cooled, a slow rhythm that mimics the natural cycle of day and night. The person who tends the mat does not interfere during these hours. There is nothing to do while the sun is shining except to let it shine. The drying process cannot be rushed. Too much heat too quickly would case harden the beans, sealing the moisture inside and preventing proper curing. The slow alternation of sun and cloud is exactly what is needed. A gentle, persistent drawing out of water that leaves the internal structure of the bean intact. Late in the afternoon, the sun begins its descent toward the western trees. The light takes on a golden quality, becoming softer and more diffuse. The shadows of the trees stretch out across the clearing and gradually encroach on the mat. One by one, the beans fall into shade, starting from the edge nearest the forest and moving inward as the shadow line advances. By the time the sun touches the tops of the western canopy, the entire mat is in shadow, and the direct warmth of the day is over. The beans have been in the sun for perhaps 6 or 7 hours, and they have lost a measurable amount of their moisture. They are slightly smaller than they were this morning, slightly darker in color. Their shells have begun to wrinkle very faintly, a delicate pattern of fine lines that appears on the surface like the cracking of old varnish. The person returns as the light fades. They walk slowly across the clearing and crouch beside the mat, examining the beans in the dim golden light. They pick up a single bean and roll it between their fingers, testing its texture. The shell is still soft, but it has lost its initial tackiness. It feels dry to the touch, though there is still a slight give when pressed, a sign that the cotyledon inside remains moist. The person places the bean back on the mat and then begins the evening task. They gather the edges of the woven mat and fold them inward, covering the beans in a loose bundle. This is not a tight wrapping like the fermentation leaves, but a simple covering that will protect the beans from the dampness of the night air. The folded mat is left in place on the raised frame, and the person walks away into the gathering dusk. Night falls over the clearing. The temperature drops and the humidity rises, as it always does in this forest after sunset. The air becomes thick and heavy with moisture, condensing on every cool surface. If the beans were left uncovered, they would absorb this moisture, undoing some of the day's drying work. The woven mat provides a barrier that slows this exchange, keeping the beans just dry enough until morning. The stars appear overhead, visible through the gap in the canopy, their light a cold, distant glimmer that has no effect on the warm brown beans sleeping under their palm frond cover. The forest sounds continue through the night, the chirping of frogs and the steady drone of insects, a constant background that accompanies the slow respiration of the drying beans. Morning comes again. The first light is grey and indirect, filtering through the mist that rises from the damp ground. The person returns early, before the sun has cleared the eastern trees. They unfold the mat, spreading the beans out once more into a single, even layer. The beans look different in the morning light. They are slightly darker than they were yesterday, a deeper shade of reddish-brown. The fine wrinkles on their shells are more pronounced now, visible across the entire surface. When the person touches a handful, the beans feel cool and slightly damp on the outside, though they know that the interior is still wet. This is the pattern of drying. The surface moisture evaporates quickly in the sun, but the deeper moisture takes much longer to migrate outward. The sun rises above the trees and the day's warmth begins again. You watch as the light creeps across the clearing and falls onto the mat. The beans warm up and the faint shimmer of evaporation reappears. The second day of drying is much like the first. The sun climbs to its zenith and then descends. Clouds pass over, bringing brief shadows. The beans lie motionless, absorbing and releasing their moisture in a slow, steady rhythm. By the end of the second day, they have shrunk noticeably. The wrinkles on their shells are deeper now, forming a network of fine creases that cover the entire surface. The color has deepened, further approaching the rich dark brown that is characteristic of properly dried cacao. On the third day, the person does something different. Around midday, when the sun is at its hottest, they walk out to the mat and begin to turn the beans. This is a simple process, a gentle raking with a wooden paddle that shifts the beans into new positions. The ones that were at the edges are moved to the center. The ones that were facing upward are turned over. This ensures that every bean receives the same exposure to the sun and the air. The person works slowly, moving across the mat in a steady rhythm. The sound of the beans rustling against the woven palm fronds is soft and dry, like the whisper of fallen leaves in a light breeze. When the turning is finished, the beans lie in a slightly different arrangement, but otherwise unchanged. The person returns to the shade and the sun continues its work. The days pass in this way. You lose count of them after a while. The routine is always the same. The mat is uncovered in the morning. The sun shines, clouds pass, the beans grow darker and smaller and more wrinkled. In the evening, the mat is folded closed. The nights are cool and damp and full of insect sounds. Each day, the person turns the beans at least once. sometimes twice if the sun is particularly strong. The turning becomes easier as the beans dry because they no longer stick together. They roll and slide against one another with a dry clicking sound like small pebbles being stirred. By the 5th or 6th day, the beans have reached a critical point in their drying. The surface is completely dry and the shell is crisp and brittle to the touch. The wrinkles have become deep fissures that run along the length of each bean. The color is now a dark, rich brown, almost the color of finished chocolate, though the aroma is still faint and earthy. If you were to break one open, which you do not because you are only watching, you would find that the cotyledon inside has shrunk away from the shell, leaving a small gap. The interior is a lighter brown than the exterior, and it is still slightly soft, slightly pliable. This is the sign that the drying is not yet complete. The center of the bean must lose its remaining moisture before the process can end. The person tests the beans each day. They pick up a handful and squeeze them gently, listening to the sound they make. Wet beans are silent. Damp beans make a dull, soft sound. Dry beans make a dull, soft sound. Dry beans make a sharp, crisp rustle like dry leaves or paper. The person also breaks open a few beans to examine the interior. They are looking for the moment when the cotyledon snaps cleanly when bent, a sign that the moisture content has fallen to the proper level. This is the goal of the drying process, to reduce the water inside the bean from nearly 60% down to about 7%. At 7% moisture, the bean is stable. It will not mold. It will not rot. It can be stored for months or transported across oceans without spoiling. This is the state that the beans must reach before they can leave this clearing. The sun continues to shine. The days remain warm and the nights remain cool. The beans lie on the mat, day after day, slowly giving up their last reserves of moisture. The change is almost imperceptible now. You cannot see the water leaving. You can only see the gradual deepening of the color and the slow tightening of the shell around the shrinking cotyledon. The aroma of the beans has changed as well. The sharp, vinegary notes of fermentation have faded almost completely, replaced by a mild, earthy scent, with hints of something nutty and something faintly floral. This is the smell of cured cocoa, the smell that will later be intensified and transformed by roasting. But for now it is a quiet smell, a subtle presence that you only notice if you lean close to the mat. One morning the person comes to the mat and does not unfold it immediately. They stand for a moment looking at the bundled palm fronds, and then they crouch down and open a corner. They reach inside and pull out a handful of beans. The beans are dark and wrinkled, their shells crisp and papery. The person squeezes them and listens to the dry rustling sound. They take one bean and press it between thumb and forefinger. The shell cracks easily and falls away, revealing the cotyledon inside. The cotyledon is a deep brown with a slightly reddish tint, and when the person bends it between their fingers, it snaps cleanly with a soft, sharp sound. This is the sign they have been waiting for. The beans are dry. The person does not celebrate. There is no change in their calm expression. They simply gather the edges of the mat and begin to lift it carefully, bundling the beans into a pile at the center. The beans slide together with a soft, dry rustle, their crisp shells clicking against one another. The person transfers the beans from the mat into a large clay pot or a tightly woven basket. The pot is clean and dry, and it has a fitted lid that will keep out moisture and insects. The beans fill the pot nearly to the brim, a dark mass of wrinkled seeds that have traveled from pod to fermentation to sun. The empty mat is rolled up and set aside to be used again for the next harvest. The clearing is quiet now. The sun shines on the bare ground where the mat once lay, warming the exposed earth. A few stray beans have fallen during the transfer, and they lie scattered on the soil, their dark shells contrasting with the pale dirt. The person picks them up one by one and adds them to the pot. Then they lift the pot, holding it against their hip, and walk away into the shade of the trees. You watch them go. The beans are now ready for the next part of their journey. They are stable and preserved, their moisture reduced to a safe level, their internal chemistry set by the fermentation and fixed by the drying. They can wait in this state for a long time, stored in a cool, dry place while the world moves around them. They will be carried to a larger village perhaps, and then to a market where they will be counted and valued and exchanged. They will be loaded into canoes and carried across calm waters. They will be packed into the holds of ships and rocked by the motion of the open sea. All of this lies ahead of them, an uncertain future that will take them far from the forest where they grew. But for now, they are simply resting in the darkness of the clay pot, listening to the quiet sounds of the person's footsteps on the soft earth and the distant calls of birds in the high canopy. The clearing behind you remains empty. The sun continues its arc across the sky. The mat lies rolled and waiting. The trees stand tall and patient, their roots deep in the rich soil, their branches full of new pods that will someday follow the same path from flower to fruit to pile to sun. The cycle goes on as it has for countless years, and somewhere in the cool shade of the forest, the beans sleep in their clay vessel, dreaming of nothing, waiting for whatever comes next. The beans are no longer in the clearing. They have been moved from the clay pot into a coarse woven sack made from the fibers of the agave plant, or perhaps from rough-spun cotton grown in the lowlands. The sack is sturdy and tightly woven, its surface a pale tan color with darker flecks where the fibers have twisted together. It has been filled with the dried beans until it is plump and heavy, and then the open end has been folded over and secured with a length of twisted vine. The sack now sits among other similar sacks in the bottom of a long canoe carved from a single massive tree trunk. The canoe rests on calm water. This water is not the open sea, but a broad, sheltered lake or a wide, slow-moving river that winds through the lowland forests. The surface of the water is smooth and dark, reflecting the green of the surrounding trees and the pale blue of the sky above. Small ripples spread out from the hull of the canoe where it touches the water. But these ripples are gentle, and they fade quickly into the general stillness. The canoe is heavy laden with many sacks and bundles, all arranged in neat rows along the bottom. It sits low in the water, but it is stable, its wide, flat bottom designed for carrying cargo across these placid inland waterways. You are inside one of the sacks. Your perspective is limited to what you can see through the gaps in the coarse weave, a narrow view of the world outside. The fibers of the sack form a grid of pale lines through which you can see fragments of the canoe interior. Other sacks stacked nearby, the curved wooden side of the hull, and beyond that, the dark water and the distant green line of the shore. The light that filters through the weave is soft and diffuse, tinged with the brown of the sack material. Everything you see is broken into small squares like looking through a screen. The canoe begins to move. You do not see the paddlers because they are at the front and the back of the long vessel far from where you rest. You only feel the motion, a slow forward glide accompanied by a faint rhythmic creaking. This creak comes from the wood of the hull as it flexes ever so slightly with the movement of the water and the shifting weight of the cargo. It is a low sound, a deep groaning note that repeats at irregular intervals whenever a small wave passes under the bow. Along with the creak, there is the sound of water lapping against the sides of the canoe, a soft, continuous plashing that never stops. These two sounds, the creak of the wood and the lap of the water, become the constant background of the journey. The motion of the canoe is a gentle rocking. It sways from side to side in a slow rhythm that follows the natural movement of the water. Sometimes the sway is barely perceptible, a slight tilting that you feel more than see. Other times, when a larger ripple passes under the hull, the canoe rolls a little more deeply and the sacks shift against one another with a soft rustling sound. The beans inside the sack press together with each movement, their dry shells clicking faintly. This clicking is a quiet sound like the stirring of dry leaves far away. It adds another layer to the quiet music of the voyage. Time passes in a way that is difficult to measure. The light that comes through the weave of the sack changes slowly. In the morning it is pale and cool with a slight golden tint as the sun rises over the eastern shore. Around midday it becomes brighter and whiter, the gaps in the weave, glowing like small hot windows. In the afternoon it softens again, taking on a warmer amber hue as the sun descends toward the treetops. And in the evening it fades to a dim grey and then to darkness broken only by the faintest glimmer of starlight reflecting off the water. You cannot see the stars themselves through the sack, but you can sense the change from the complete black of night to the softer darkness that contains a hint of distant light. The paddlers are quiet. You hear their voices, sometimes a low murmur of conversation that drifts back from the front of the canoe. The words are indistinct, carried away by the water and the distance. so that all you catch is the tone, a calm, unhurried exchange between people who have made this journey many times before. There is no urgency in their voices, no excitement or concern. They speak in the same slow rhythm as the paddles dipping into the water, a steady beat that matches the creak of the wood and the lap of the waves. The canoe moves along the shoreline. Through the gaps in the sack you can see the green wall of the forest sliding past. The trees grow right down to the water's edge, their roots exposed in tangled masses where the soil has been washed away by the gentle currents. Some of the branches hang low over the water, trailing their leaves in the surface and creating small patches of shade that the canoe passes through, one after another. The view changes slowly, one tree giving way to the next, each one slightly different in shape and height, but all blending into a continuous green blur. There are no clearings, no breaks in the forest, just the unending wall of vegetation that marks the boundary between water and land. Birds fly overhead sometimes. You see them through the gaps in the weave, dark shapes against the pale sky. They move with quick flaps and then long glides, their shadows flickering across the surface of the water. Their calls echo across the lake, high sharp notes that cut through the low sounds of the canoe and then fade away. Other than the birds and the occasional splash of a fish breaking the surface, there is little sign of life. The lake seems empty and still, a vast quiet space that holds the canoe in its slow embrace. The sun rises higher and the heat increases. The air inside the sack becomes warm and slightly stuffy. Though the coarse weave allows some circulation, the beans themselves absorb the warmth, their dark shells holding the heat like small stones left in the sun. They give off a faint smell, the dry earthy aroma of cured cocoa that mingles with the scent of the agave fibers and the damp woody smell of the canoe hull. It is not an unpleasant smell, just a quiet presence that fills the small space inside the sack. Around midday the canoe pauses. You feel the forward motion cease and the rocking become more pronounced as the paddlers rest their paddles across the gunwales. The canoe drifts, slowly turning broadside to the gentle current. You hear the sound of water being poured from a gourd and the quiet murmur of the paddlers as they eat something simple, perhaps dried maize cakes or pieces of fruit. The pause lasts for a while, a stretch of stillness broken only by the lap of the water and the distant calls of birds. Then the paddles dip again and the forward motion resumes. The afternoon is much like the morning. The canoe glides along the shoreline, the green walls sliding past in an endless procession of leaves and trunks and trailing vines. The sun moves across the sky and the light shifts from white to gold. The heat of the day begins to ease, replaced by a softer warmth that carries the first hint of evening coolness. The sounds remain the same, the creak of the wood, the lap of the water, the soft rustle of the sacks shifting with the motion of the canoe. As evening approaches, the light takes on a reddish tint. The sun is low, now hidden behind the trees on the western shore, but its glow spreads across the sky and reflects off the water in long streaks of orange and pink. Through the gaps in the sack you can see these colors fragmented into small bright squares, like a mosaic of sunset. The beauty of it is distant and abstract, something you observe without feeling because you are only a passenger inside a sack of beans. But it is there nonetheless, a quiet display that marks the end of another day. The canoe continues moving even as darkness falls. The paddlers know this waterway well, and they can navigate by the shape of the shoreline against the night sky. The paddles dip more slowly now, a steady, unhurried rhythm that carries the canoe forward through the dark water. The sounds of the night begin to emerge, the high chirping of tree frogs from the forest and the deeper drone of insects. These sounds mix with the creak and lap of the canoe, creating a complex tapestry of quiet noise that fills the darkness. You drift in and out of awareness. There is no sleep for a sack of beans, but there is a kind of suspension, a long pause in which nothing happens and nothing changes. The darkness is complete inside the sack, broken only by the faintest glimmer when a paddle splash catches the starlight. The rocking continues, a gentle cradle motion that never stops. The beans press against one another, their dry shells clicking softly with each sway. The smell of cured cocoa is stronger now, concentrated in the close darkness of the sack. Morning comes slowly. The first light is grey and uncertain, seeping through the weave in pale threads. The forest sounds change as the night creatures fall silent and the day birds begin their tentative calls. The paddlers stir, and the rhythm of the paddles picks up slightly, resuming the steady pace of the day journey. The canoe moves on through the mist that rises from the warm water, meeting the cool morning air. Through the gaps, you see the mist as a white haze that blurs the green shoreline into soft, indistinct shapes. The second day of travel is much like the first. The sun rises and warms the sack. The canoe creaks and rocks. The water laps against the hull. The shoreline slides past one tree at a time. There is a sameness to it all, a repetition that blurs the hours together until you cannot tell morning from afternoon except by the angle of the light. This is the nature of long journeys by water, a slow accumulation of distance that happens without any visible marker of progress. You are moving, but you do not feel the movement. You are traveling, but the view through the weave remains the same green wall of forest, the same dark water, the same pale sky. At some point, the shoreline changes. The dense forest gives way to more open country patches of grassland and scattered trees. The water widens and the canoe moves farther from the shore into the center of a larger lake. The view through the sack becomes mostly water and sky with only a thin green line on the horizon. The motion of the canoe changes as well, becoming a longer, slower roll as the vessel encounters the broader swells of the open water. The creak of the wood deepens and a lap of the waves becomes more pronounced, a steady slosh and gurgle along the hull. The paddlers adjust their rhythm to the open water. Their strokes are longer and slower, matching the larger motion of the canoe. They speak less now, their voices carrying less often across the distance. There is only the sound of the paddles and the water and the water, a quiet trio that plays without variation for hour after hour. You feel the weight of the journey. The beans have been in this sack for a long time now, longer than they spent in the fermentation pile or drying on the mat. The darkness and the warmth and the constant motion have become their entire world. They have forgotten the forest and the pod and the sun. They are only beans in a sack in a canoe on a lake that seems to have no end. But the lake does have an end. After another day of travel, or perhaps 2 days, the shoreline draws closer again. The green wall of forest returns first as a thin line on the horizon, and then as a solid presence that blocks out the open sky. The canoe enters a narrower channel, a river mouth, or a strait between islands. The water becomes calmer, and the motion of the canoe settles back into the gentle rocking of the first day. Through the gaps in the sack you see the trees again, their roots trailing in the water, their branches hanging low overhead. The paddlers guide the canoe toward a landing place. You cannot see it yet, but you sense the change in their movements, the way the paddles dip more frequently and with more purpose. The canoe slows and turns, and then there is a soft grinding sound, as the hull touches bottom, scraping against sand or mud. The motion stops. The canoe is still. You hear the paddlers stepping out, splashing through shallow water to pull the canoe farther up onto the shore. Their voices are clearer now, no longer carried away by the wind. They speak in calm tones, discussing the unloading of the cargo. You feel the canoe tilt as one of them climbs back in and begins to move the sacks. Hands grasp the coarse fabric of your sack and lift. There is a moment of weightlessness as the sack is hoisted, and then a solid thump as it is set down on dry land. The view through the weave changes. You see bare earth and scattered leaves and the lower trunks of trees. The light is different here, dappled by the canopy overhead. The sounds are different too, no longer the lap of water but the rustle of leaves and the distant hum of many voices. You have arrived at the settlement, a place where the water journey ends and something else begins. The sack sits on the ground among other sacks, waiting. The beans inside are still and quiet, their long rocking finally over. They have traveled far from the forest clearing, but they are not yet at their final destination. There will be more journeys, more hands, more sacks and canoes, and eventually something larger than a canoe, something that sails on water far deeper and wider than this placid lake. But for now they rest on the solid earth, listening to the new sounds of this unfamiliar place, while the paddlers unload the rest of the cargo and the sun continues its slow arc across the sky. The sack has been carried from the landing place along a wide path of packed earth. It was lifted and set down and lifted again, passing through a series of hands, each one transferring the weight without comment or hurry. Now the sack rests on the ground in a large open space, a plaza of smooth-worn stones and hard-packed soil that stretches out under the open sky. This plaza is surrounded by low buildings made of stone, and adobe, their walls painted in faded shades of red and white. The buildings cast long rectangles of shade across the stones, providing cool places where people sit and wait and conduct their quiet business. The plaza is not empty, but it is not crowded either. The main activity happens in other parts of the market, in the sections where fresh produce is displayed on woven mats and where the smell of cooking food drifts through the air. Here in this corner, the atmosphere is different. It is quieter, more subdued. This is the place where goods are counted and valued, and recorded, where the exchange happens, not in loud voices but in calm murmurs and the soft sounds of objects being moved from one pile to another. You are inside the sack still. The coarse weave has become familiar by now, a grid of pale fibers, through which you have watched the world change from green forest to blue water to brown earth. The sack sits among other sacks, some larger, some smaller, all containing things that have traveled from distant places. There are sacks of dried maize and sacks of beans of other kinds, black beans and red beans and pale speckled beans. There are bundles of feathers tied with cord and small clay pots sealed with wax. And there are other sacks like yours containing dried cacao beans, each one a small store of value waiting to be counted. A hand reaches down and loosens the vine that secures the neck of the sack. The opening is folded back, and the contents are exposed to the light for the first time in many days. The beans inside have settled during the journey, the smaller fragments and dust sifting to the bottom, while the whole beans rest on top. They are dark and wrinkled, their shells crisp and dry. The smell of cured cocoa rises from the open sack, a faint earthy aroma that mingles with the other scents of the plaza, the dust of the stones, the faint sweetness of copal incense drifting from somewhere nearby. The hand reaches into the sack and scoops out a portion of beans. They are poured onto a smooth woven mat that has been spread on the ground. The sound of the pouring is a soft, dry rustle, like the shifting of small pebbles or the falling of autumn leaves. The beans spread out across the mat, forming a dark brown mound against the pale fibers. More beans follow, scoop after scoop, until the mat is covered with a generous pile and the sack sits half empty beside it. The person who is doing the counting sits cross-legged on the ground beside the mat. This person wears simple clothing of undyed cotton, and their hands are calm and steady. They have done this work many times before, and their movements show the ease of long practice. They reach out and begin to separate the beans into smaller groups, pushing them across the mat with a small flat stick of polished wood. The stick is about the length of a hand, and it glides smoothly over the woven surface. The counting begins. The person uses the stick to draw a small number of beans toward themselves, perhaps 5 or 6 at a time. They count silently, their lips moving slightly as they track the numbers. The beans are pushed into a neat pile, and then another, and then another. Each pile contains exactly 20 beans. This is the unit of counting, the base that everyone understands. 20 beans make 1 count. 20 counts make 400. The system is simple and ancient, built on the numbers of fingers and toes. You watch the piles grow. The person works with a slow, steady rhythm. The stick moves across the mat, pushing beans together. The fingers occasionally reach out to adjust a bean that has rolled away or to straighten the pile that is leaning. The sound is a soft, continuous rustle, broken by the occasional click of a bean against the wooden stick. The light in the plaza is bright, but the mat is in the shade of a building, so the beans are illuminated by a soft, indirect glow that shows their deep brown color and the fine network of wrinkles on each shell. The counting takes a long time. There is no hurry in this place. The sun moves slowly across the sky, and the shadow of the building creeps across the stones, but the person on the mat does not look up. They continue to count, pushing beans into piles of 20 and then gathering those piles into larger groups. When 20 piles of 20 have been made, they are swept together into a single larger heap representing 400 beans. This heap is transferred to a different part of the mat or into a waiting container. Then the counting resumes with the next portion of beans. The beans themselves are patient. They have waited through the long growth on the tree and the slow fermentation under the leaves and the days of drying in the sun and the rocking journey across the water. Waiting here on this mat in the quiet corner of the plaza is just another pause in their long journey. They lie still while the stick moves among them, pushing and sorting and counting. Some of the beans are whole and perfect. their shells intact and their weight substantial. Others are broken fragments that have cracked during the drying or the transport. These fragments are not discarded. They have value too, though less than the whole beans. The person separates them carefully, pushing the broken pieces into a small pile of their own. As the counting continues, you begin to notice the details of the beans more clearly. Each one is slightly different from its neighbors. Some are longer and thinner, almost almond-shaped. Others are rounder and plumper. The wrinkles on the shells form unique patterns like the lines on a human palm, no two exactly alike. The color varies as well, from a deep reddish-brown to a darker shade that is almost black. These differences come from the position of the bean inside the pod and from the slight variations in fermentation and drying. But in the counting, none of these differences matter. A bean is a bean. Each whole bean counts as one. The person counting occasionally picks up a bean and examines it more closely. They roll it between thumb and forefinger, feeling its weight and its texture. They listen to the faint click it makes when tapped against another bean. This is a quality check, a quiet assessment of the bean's condition. Beans that have been properly fermented and dried have a certain heft, a certain resonance. Beans that are moldy or under-fermented are lighter and duller. The person sets aside any beans that do not meet the standard, placing them in a separate small pile for later use or disposal. Most of the beans pass the test. They are good beans, well cured and properly dried, the product of careful hands and patient attention. The value of the beans extends beyond this mat. You cannot see it, but you can sense it in the quiet respect with which they are handled. These beans are not just seeds. They are a form of wealth, a medium of exchange that moves through the market like water through a stream. A small basket of maize might cost 10 beans. A simple cotton cloak might cost 65 beans. A rabbit for the cooking pot might be worth 30 beans. A rabbit for the cooking pot might be worth 30 beans or more. A good obsidian knife might cost 200 beans. The prices are known to everyone, not written down, but held in the collective memory of the market. The beans are the measure against which other things are valued. You imagine the goods that these beans could become. The pile on the mat contains many hundreds of beans, perhaps several thousand. This is a significant amount of wealth, enough to buy a fine woven mantle, or a large quantity of salt, or the services of a skilled artisan for many days. The beans themselves will not be used for all of these things directly. Some of them will be taken to the kitchen and ground into a bitter drink. Others will be stored away as savings, a reserve of value for future needs. And still others will continue their journey, passing from hand to hand, moving through the market and out into the wider world. The counting continues through the morning. The person on the mat works without pause, their movements steady and unhurried. The pile of uncounted beans grows smaller, and the piles of counted beans grow larger. The broken fragments accumulate in their own small heap, a modest collection of pieces and dust that will be used for lesser purposes, perhaps ground into powder for a cheaper drink or added to other mixtures. Nothing is wasted. Every part of the bean has some use. The sun reaches its zenith and the plaza grows warm. The shadows shrink to thin dark lines at the base of the buildings. The person counting pauses to wipe their brow with a cloth and to take a drink of water from a small clay cup. They sit quietly for a moment, looking out across the plaza where other people are engaged in their own quiet transactions. A woman walks past carrying a basket of small golden fruits on her head. Two men sit against a wall talking in low voices. A dog trots across the stones and disappears into an alley. The scene is calm and ordinary, a slow-moving picture of daily life. The counting resumes. The stick moves across the mat, pushing beans into piles of 20. The rustling sound continues, soft and dry and repetitive. You find yourself drifting into the rhythm of it, the steady back and forth of the stick, the quiet click of bean against bean, the slow accumulation of counted wealth. Time becomes measured not in hours, but in piles. Each pile of 20 is a small unit of time, a moment that passes and is replaced by the next. By the middle of the afternoon, the counting is nearly complete. The mat is covered with neat rows of 20 bean piles, arranged in a grid that shows the total at a glance. The person sits back and surveys their work, their eyes moving across the rows and columns, verifying the count. They reach out and adjust a few beans that have rolled out of place, tucking them back into their proper piles. Then they begin the final tally, adding up the rows in their head, or perhaps with the aid of small marks made on a piece of bark paper. The total is a number that you do not know. It does not matter. What matters is the act of counting, the careful attention paid to each bean. This is how value is established, not through loud proclamation, but through quiet measurement. The beans have been seen and touched and counted. They have been given their place in the order of things. When the counting is finished, the person begins to transfer the beans into a different container. This container is a larger clay pot with a wide mouth and a fitted lid. The beans are poured in carefully, each pile lifted and tipped so that the beans slide into the pot with a soft rushing sound. The pot fills slowly, its interior growing dark with the accumulated beans. The broken pieces are added last, scattered over the top like a dark garnish. The lid is placed on the pot and pressed down firmly. The person rises to their feet, brushing the dust from their clothing. They lift the pot and carry it a short distance to a shaded alcove where other pots and sacks are stored. The pot is set down among its fellows, a collection of containers, each one holding its own counted wealth. The alcove is cool and dim, protected from the sun and the rain. Here the beans will wait until they are needed. You remain with the beans in the darkness of the pot. The light that filtered through the weave of the sack is gone, now replaced by complete blackness. The sounds of the plaza are muffled by the thick clay walls, reduced to a distant murmur that rises and falls like the sound of the sea. The beans are still and quiet, their long journey from the forest paused once again. They've been counted and valued and stored. They are no longer just seeds. They're currency, a store of wealth, a promise of future exchange. The day outside the pot continues. The sun moves across the sky, and the shadows lengthen. The market slowly winds down as people finish their business and return to their homes. The sounds of the plaza fade from a murmur to a whisper, and then to near silence. The pot sits in the alcove undisturbed. Inside the pot, the beans rest in their darkness. They do not know that they are valuable. They do not know that they will one day be ground into paste and mixed with water and spices. They do not know that they will cross an ocean and arrive in a world utterly different from this one. They only know the darkness and the stillness and the faint pressure of the beans above them, and that is enough. For now, that is everything. The night comes and the plaza is empty. A single figure walks across the stones carrying a small clay lamp that casts a pool of warm light. The figure checks the alcove, making sure the pots are secure and the lids are tight. Then they walk away and the plaza returns to darkness. The beans sleep in their clay vessel, dreaming of nothing, waiting for the next hand that will reach for them and carry them forward on their long, slow journey. The clay pot did not remain in the shaded alcove for very long. After some days or perhaps weeks, a period of waiting that passed without marker or measure, the pot was lifted and carried again. It moved through the plaza and along narrow streets and eventually into a different kind of space. A large stone building near the water's edge where goods were gathered for longer journeys. Here, the beans were transferred from the clay pot into something new. They were poured into a wooden crate. The crate was made of rough sawn planks of oak or perhaps pine cut from trees that grew in forests very different from the one where the cacao tree had stood. The wood was pale and fibrous with a sharp, clean smell that spoke of northern hills and cold winters. The planks had been fitted together with iron nails, and the joints were tight, though not perfectly sealed. Small gaps remained between the boards, gaps that would allow air to move in and out, and would also allow you to see fragments of the world outside. The crate was rectangular, about the length of a human arm in each direction, and it was filled nearly to the top with the dark, wrinkled beans. A lid was nailed into place with several heavy blows of a mallet, each strike sending a dull vibration through the wood and into the beans. Then the crate was lifted and carried onto a ship. You could not see the ship from inside the crate, but you could feel its immense size in the way the crate was carried up a long ramp and then lowered into a deep, dark space. The sounds changed as you descended. The open-air sounds of the dock, the calls of birds and the murmur of voices faded, and were replaced by enclosed sounds, the echo of footsteps on wooden planks, and the creak of a large vessel shifting against its moorings. The crate was set down on a solid surface and then pushed and slid into position alongside other crates and barrels and bundles. You were in the hold. The hold was a vast, low-ceilinged chamber in the bottom of the ship below the waterline. It was dark. The only light came from the open hatch, far above a square of pale sky that seemed impossibly distant. When the hatch was open, a shaft of light fell down through the layers of decking, illuminating a small patch of the hold floor. But the crate where you rested was not in that patch. It was in the deep shadow at the edge of the space, where the light never reached directly. There was only a faint indirect glow, a dimness that allowed you to perceive shapes but not details, and when the hatch was closed, which it was for most of the time, there was no light at all. The darkness was complete, a thick black silence that pressed against your awareness. In this darkness, the other senses became more acute. Sound became the primary way of understanding the world, and the ship was full of sound. The first sound was the creak and groan of the wooden hull. The ship was a living thing in its way, a massive structure of timber and iron that flexed and shifted constantly in response to the pressure of the water. The planks of the hull rubbed against one another as the ship rolled, producing a low, continuous groaning that rose and fell in pitch. This sound was always present, a deep bass note that underlay everything else. It was the voice of the ship itself, a slow, patient exhale that never stopped. The second sound was the rhythmic slosh of water. Somewhere beneath the crate, in the very bottom of the hold, there was a layer of bilge water. This water had seeped in through the seams of the hull, or dripped down from the decks above, and it collected in the lowest part of the ship. As the vessel rolled from side to side, this water moved as well, sliding across the curved bottom with a wet sloshing sound that was both near and far. It was a sound like a slow wave on a distant shore, only muted and enclosed. The bilge water carried with it a faint smell of salt and damp wood, and something else, a hint of decay from the organic matter that inevitably found its way into the depths of the ship. The third sound was the high-pitched squeak of ropes and blocks. Far above, on the weather decks, the rigging was constantly in motion. The miles of hemp rope that held the masts and controlled the sails stretched and contracted with the changing humidity and the pull of the wind. Where these ropes passed through wooden blocks, they produced a sharp, repetitive squeaking, a sound like the call of a small bird, only more mechanical. This sound drifted down through the layers of decking, becoming fainter and more distant, but never entirely disappearing. It was a reminder of the world above, the world of wind and sail and human activity. The fourth sound was the ticking of the wood boring beetles. Inside the crate itself, or perhaps in the neighboring crates, there lived a small family of beetles. They were tiny creatures no larger than a grain of rice, with hard dark shells and patient jaws. They had likely been living in the wood of the crate since before it was built, the eggs laid in the living tree and now hatching in the dark warmth of the hold. They chewed slowly through the fibers of the wood, producing a faint but distinct ticking sound. It was a sound like the tapping of a fingernail on a tabletop, only much softer and more irregular. Sometimes you would hear it for several seconds in a row, a quick series of ticks, then it would fall silent for hours before resuming. The beetles were unhurried. They had all the time in the world. The crate was loaded, and the ship was made ready. For several days there was only the creak and groan of the vessel at rest, and the distant sounds of activity on the dock. The cargo hold was filled gradually with more crates and barrels and sacks, each one adding its own small contribution to the smell of the space. There was the sharp, briny scent of salted fish packed in barrels, and the sweet, dusty smell of dried fruits, and the earthy aroma of other spices, other seeds. These smells mingled together in the still air of the hold, creating a complex perfume that was not unpleasant, only dense and unfamiliar. Then one morning, the ship began to move. You felt it first as a slight change in the motion, a new kind of sway that was different from the gentle rocking at the dock. The creaking of the hull intensified, and the sloshing of the bilge water became more pronounced. The ship was being towed out of the harbor, perhaps by smaller boats with oars, or by a favorable tide. The motion was slow and deliberate, a gradual separation from the solidity of land. The real change came when the ship reached open water. The harbor had been sheltered, protected from the full force of the sea, but once the ship passed beyond the headlands and into the open ocean, the motion changed dramatically. The gentle rocking became a long, deep roll, a movement that lifted the crate and then lowered it and then lifted it again in a rhythm that never stopped. The ship was now subject to the swell of the open sea, those vast, slow waves that travel across the ocean for thousands of miles. You felt this motion through the beams around you. The crate was filled tightly so the beans could not shift or slide individually, but they pressed against one another with each roll of the ship. When the ship leaned to the left, the beans on the left side of the crate were compressed a little more firmly. When the ship leaned to the right, the pressure shifted. It was a subtle sensation, a faint tightening and releasing that happened over and over again. The beans themselves did not mind. They had been pressed together in the pod and in the fermentation pile and in the fermentation pile and in the sack and in the pot. This was just another form of closeness. The temperature began to change. When the crate had been loaded, the air in the hold was warm and humid, carrying the heat of the tropical port. But as the ship sailed north and west, the air grew gradually cooler. The change was so slow that you could not feel it from 1 hour to the next. Only over the course of several days did you notice that the wood of the crate felt less warm to the touch and that the smell of the beans had become slightly less pronounced. The cooler air was less able to carry the volatile compounds that gave the beans their earthy aroma, so the smell inside the crate grew fainter and more subdued. The humidity changed as well. The hold of a wooden ship was never truly dry. Water seeped in constantly, and the air was always heavy with moisture. But compared to the saturated atmosphere of the tropical forests, this was a different kind of dampness. It was a cool, damp, a clammy damp that clung to surfaces without the warmth of the sun. The beans, which had been dried so carefully in the clearing, now absorbed some of this moisture. Their crisp shells softened slightly, becoming less brittle. The internal moisture of the beans increased by a few percentage points, not enough to cause spoilage, but enough to change their texture. They became slightly pliable, slightly giving the days passed. You had no way to count them. There was no daylight in the hold to mark the passage of morning and afternoon. There was only the continuous motion of the ship and the continuous sounds of the hull and the water and the ropes. Sometimes the motion became more violent, and the creaking of the hull grew louder and more insistent. This happened when the ship encountered a storm. You could hear the wind as a high howl that penetrated even into the depths of the hold, and you could feel the ship lurch and shudder as waves struck the hull. The bilge water sloshed more vigorously, and the beans pressed against one another with greater force. But even these storms were not frightening from your perspective inside the crate. They were simply more intense versions of the same motion, more dramatic variations on the same theme. The crate held firm. The beans stayed in place. The storm would pass and the motion would settle back into its regular rhythm. During the calmer periods, the ship seemed almost peaceful. The long, slow roll was hypnotic, the cradle-like motion that lulled the mind into a state of quiet suspension. The sounds blended together into a constant drone, the creak and slosh and squeak merging into a single note that filled the darkness. There was nothing to do but wait. The beans were very good at waiting. They had been practicing their whole existence. The smell inside the crate continued to change. The beans were absorbing the scent of the oak wood, and the salt air, the faint vinegar notes from the fermentation had long since faded, and the earthy aroma had mellowed. Now there was a new note, a hint of something briny and sharp like the smell of the sea itself. This was the salt. Tiny particles of salt from the ocean spray were carried into the hold on the air, and they settled on every surface. The beans absorbed these particles, incorporating them into their outer shells. The salt would not harm them. In fact, it might even add a subtle complexity to their eventual flavor. But it was a change, a mark of the journey. The ticking of the beetles continued. The small creatures had not been idle during the voyage. They'd been chewing their slow, patient tunnels through the wood of the crate. You could hear their progress in the occasional faint ticking sound that emerged from the darkness. They were not many, perhaps only 2 or 3 individuals. They worked without hurry and without coordination, each one following its own path through the fibers. Their tunnels were narrow and shallow, barely penetrating the inner surface of the planks. They would not compromise the strength of the crate. They were simply another presence in the darkness, another quiet companion on the long voyage. The weeks became months. You had no way to know how much time was passing, but the accumulation of small changes told you that the journey was long. The beans had settled into the crate more compactly, their weight pressing down on the lower layers. The smell had stabilized into a constant faint presence, a blend of earth and salt and oak. The motion of the ship had become so familiar that you no longer noticed it as a separate sensation. It was simply the background, the steady rhythm against which everything else was measured. Occasionally you heard human sounds, footsteps on the deck above muffled by the layers of wood, the distant murmur of voices too faint to understand, the creak of a hatch being opened far away, and the brief intrusion of light into the hold, a pale shaft that moved across the cargo and then disappeared. Someone was checking the cargo, making sure that nothing had shifted and that no water was leaking in. The footsteps would move through the hold, pausing here and there. A hand might rest briefly on the crate as the person steadied themselves against the roll of the ship. Then the footsteps would retreat, and the hatch would close, and the darkness would return. The horizon was something you could not see, but you could feel it. The ship moved across a surface that was curved, a vast sphere of water that extended in every direction. The motion of the ship, the long, slow rise and fall, was the ship adjusting to that curvature. There was a flatness to the sensation, a sense of being suspended in a world without edges. The horizon line was not a visible thing, but a felt thing, a constant leveling that never changed. The ship rose and fell, and the horizon remained exactly where it had always been. The temperature continued to change gradually. The ship had crossed into a different climate zone, where the water was cooler and the air was less warm. The beans in the crate had grown cool to the touch, their surfaces no longer carrying any residual warmth from the tropical sun. They were now the temperature of the deep ocean, a steady coolness that never varied. This coolness helped preserve them, keeping the internal chemistry stable and preventing any new fermentation or spoilage. The journey was approaching its end, though you did not know it. There was no announcement, no change in the routine of the ship. The motion remained the same, and the sounds remained the same. But after many weeks, perhaps 2 months or 3, the character of the water changed. The long ocean swell gave way to shorter, choppier waves. The ship began to encounter other vessels more frequently, and you could hear the distant sound of bells and the calls of gulls. The smell of the air changed too, carrying a hint of land, a faint, muddy scent that was different from the clean salt of the open sea. One day the anchor was dropped. The sound was immense, a great rattling of chain that echoed through the entire ship. The crate vibrated with the noise and then fell still. The ship swung around and settled into a new rhythm, the gentle rocking of a vessel at anchor rather than under way. The hatch above was opened, and light poured down into the hold, brighter than anything you had experienced in months. The light did not reach the crate directly, but it illuminated the space enough that the darkness was replaced by a dim twilight. Voices came down from above, louder now and more numerous. They spoke in a language that was different from the one you had heard in the plaza, the language of the counting and the canoe. This language had sharper sounds and a faster rhythm. It was the language of the people who had built the ship and who would now unload its cargo. The beings did not understand the words, but they understood the tone. It was the tone of arrival. The unloading began. Crates and barrels were hoisted up through the hatch one by one. The crate where you rested was eventually lifted by ropes that were passed around it and secured with practiced knots. There was a moment of suspension as the crate rose through the air, and then it was set down on a solid surface again. The light was brighter now, and you could see through the gaps in the planks that the world outside was different. The sky was paler, and the air was cooler, and the sounds were all new. The crate was carried a short distance and set down among other crates in a warehouse on the dock. Here the beings would wait again, as they had waited so many times before. They had crossed the ocean. They had traveled from one world to another. They were no longer in the land of their origin. They were in a place called Europe, and they would soon begin the final phase of their transformation. But for now they rested in the wooden crate, listening to the new sounds of this new place, while the ship that had carried them sat quietly at anchor and the gulls cried overhead. The crate was opened in a room with thick stone walls and a high ceiling crossed by heavy wooden beams darkened by age and smoke. The light in this room came from a single tall window set deep into the wall, its panes made of small diamond-shaped pieces of glass held together by strips of lead. The glass was not perfectly clear. It had a slight greenish cast, and tiny bubbles were trapped within it, causing the light that passed through to soften and diffuse. The window looked out onto a courtyard garden where a few herbs grew in neat rows, but the view was not the focus of the room. The focus was the large stone hearth at one end and the long wooden table that ran down the center. This was the kitchen of a monastery. The walls were whitewashed with lime, giving them a pale, chalky appearance that reflected what little light there was. The floor was made of uneven red clay tiles, worn smooth in the center by centuries of sandaled feet. In the corners, the tiles were darker and rougher, holding the dust and the quiet of ages. The room smelled of cold stone and old wood, and faintly of the meals that had been prepared here over many years. A layered scent of bread and herbs and roasted meats that had soaked into the very walls. The beans were poured from the crate onto the wooden table. They spilled out in a dark cascade, a dry rustling sound that echoed slightly in the stone room. They formed a mound on the pale wood, a heap of wrinkled brown seeds that looked small and humble in this unfamiliar setting. The monk who had opened the crate was an older man with calm hands and a patient expression. He wore a simple robe of undyed wool tied at the waist with a cord. His sleeves were pushed back, revealing forearms that were lean and strong from years of work in the garden and the kitchen. He looked at the pile of beans for a long moment. Then he reached out and picked up a handful, letting them run through his fingers, back onto the table. He smelled them, bringing his hand close to his face and inhaling the faint, earthy aroma that still clung to the shells. He had smelled this before. The monastery had received shipments of cacao beans for some years now, ever since the brothers who traveled across the sea had sent word of this strange, bitter seed that the people of the new lands valued so highly. At first the beans had been a curiosity, a novelty to be examined and discussed. But over time the monks had learned what to do with them. They had learned to roast and grind and mix them into a dark, frothy drink that warmed the body and sharpened the mind during long hours of prayer and study. The monk turned from the table and walked to the hearth. A small fire had been burning there since early morning, not a large roaring blaze, but a modest bed of coals that glowed a steady orange red. The fire was contained within a stone alcove, and above it hung an iron crane from which a pot could be suspended. Beside the hearth on the stone floor sat a flat clay comel, a round griddle of unglazed earthenware that had been warming gently near the coals. The monk lifted the comel with a thick cloth and set it directly over the heat. He waited while the clay absorbed the warmth, its surface becoming hot enough that a drop of water flicked onto it would skitter and vanish in a puff of steam. When the comel was ready, the monk returned to the table and scooped up a portion of the beans. He spread them across the hot clay surface in a single layer. The beans made a soft hissing sound as they met the heat, the residual moisture inside them flashing into steam. The monk watched them carefully, using a flat wooden paddle to stir and turn the beans so that they roasted evenly on all sides. The smell that rose from the comel was unlike anything that had come from the beans before. The earthy aroma deepened and intensified, taking on notes of toasted bread and warm nuts and something faintly smoky. This was the moment when the precursors created during fermentation finally came together, when the amino acids and sugars reacted in the heat to produce the complex flavor that humans would come to crave. The roasting took time. The monk did not rush. He moved the beans back and forth across the hot clay, his movements slow and rhythmic. The sound was a soft shuffling, like dry leaves stirred by a gentle wind. The beans darkened further their shells, turning from brown to a deep, glossy black. Some of them cracked open with a faint popping sound as the steam inside expanded beyond what the shell could contain. The aroma filled the kitchen, rising up to the high ceiling and spreading into the corners. It was a rich, warm smell that promised comfort and sustenance. When the beans were evenly roasted, the monk lifted the comel from the fire and set it on a stone trivet to cool. The beans continued to crackle softly as their temperature dropped. The monk left them there and turned to another task. From a high shelf he took down a small clay jar sealed with a cork and a layer of wax. Inside the jar was sugar. This sugar had come from far away, as well grown on islands in the warm sea and refined into white crystals that sparkled like tiny gems. The monk poured a measure of the sugar into a small bowl and set it aside. Then he reached for another jar, this one containing cinnamon bark rolled into tight quills that smelled of warmth and sweetness. He selected 2 quills and placed them beside the sugar. From a third jar he took a single dried vanilla pod, dark and wrinkled and fragrant, with a floral perfume that was almost intoxicating. The beans had cooled enough to handle. The monk gathered them into a wooden bowl and carried them to a low stone counter where a metate waited. The metate was a curved grinding stone, a saddle-shaped piece of dark volcanic rock that had been worn smooth by years of use. It sat on the counter at an angle supported by 3 small legs carved from the same stone. Beside it lay the mano, a smaller oblong stone that fit perfectly into the curve of the metate. The monk knelt on a low cushion in front of the metate and poured a handful of roasted beans onto its surface. The grinding began. The monk gripped the mano with both hands and pressed it down onto the beans, using a rocking motion that crushed them against the stone. The sound was a low, grinding crunch, the sound of hard shells breaking and yielding. The monk worked slowly, letting the weight of the stone do most of the work. He pushed the mano forward and then drew it back, each stroke crushing the beans a little more finely. The pieces grew smaller and the sound changed from a crunch to a softer, more liquid scrape. The beans released their fat. Inside each roasted bean was a significant amount of cocoa butter, a pale yellowish fat that was solid at room temperature but melted under the friction and pressure of the grinding. As the monk continued to work, the crushed beans began to form a paste. The paste was thick and dark and glossy, clinging to the surface of the metate and to the face of the mano. The monk scraped it together with a wooden spatula, gathering the paste into a mass and then spreading it out again so that it would grind more evenly. The motion was repetitive and calming, the scrape of the spatula followed by the grind of the stone, a quiet rhythm that had been performed in this kitchen many times before. The paste became smoother as the minutes passed. The gritty texture of the crushed shells softened as the particles were reduced to a finer and finer size. The heat generated by the friction helped to melt the cocoa butter further, lubricating the mixture. The monk added a pinch of the sugar from the bowl, sprinkling the white crystals over the dark paste. The sugar dissolved into the fat, and the paste became slightly glossier. More sugar followed a little at a time, until the monk judged that the sweetness was balanced. Then he added the cinnamon and the vanilla, crushing the cinnamon quills against the stone and scraping the tiny black seeds from the vanilla pod into the mixture. The grinding continued. The spices were incorporated into the paste, their flavors mingling with the deep, rich notes of the roasted cacao. The smell in the kitchen had changed again, becoming sweeter and more complex. There was the dark base of the chocolate, the warm spice of the cinnamon, and the floral high note of the vanilla, all layered together into a perfume that made the cold stone room feel warmer and more welcoming. The monk worked for a long time. His movements were unhurried and precise, the result of many hours of practice. He knew by the feel of the paste under the stone when it was ready. It should be perfectly smooth, with no detectable grit, like thick cream or softened butter. He tested it by taking a small amount on the tip of his finger and rubbing it against his thumb. It was silky and warm, and it melted instantly from the heat of his skin. Satisfied, he scraped all of the paste together into a single mass and transferred it to a small clay bowl. The next step required hot water. The monk hung an iron pot from the crane over the hearth and filled it with fresh water from a stone cistern in the corner of the kitchen. The water was cold and clear, having been drawn from a deep well that morning. The monk added a few more sticks to the fire and waited while the flames licked up around the pot. The water began to warm gradually. Small bubbles appeared on the bottom of the pot and then rose to the surface. The monk watched the water without impatience, his hands resting quietly in his lap. When the water was hot but not boiling, the monk lifted the pot from the crane and carried it to the table. He set it down on a thick tile and then turned to a shelf where several cups and pots were arranged. He selected a small ceramic pitcher with a narrow spout and a matching cup. The pitcher was plain unglazed clay on the outside, but its interior was glazed with a dark brown slip that would not absorb flavors. The cup was similarly simple, its only decoration a single incised line that circled the rim. The monk spooned a portion of the chocolate paste into the pitcher. The paste was thick and reluctant to leave the spoon, and he had to scrape it against the rim of the pitcher to release it. Then he poured a small amount of the hot water over the paste, just enough to cover it. He took a wooden molinillo, a slender stick with a carved bulb at the end, and placed it between his palms. He rolled the stick back and forth, rapidly spinning the carved bulb inside the pitcher. The paste and water mixed together, creating a dark, frothy liquid that rose up the sides of the pitcher. The monk continued to spin the molinillo, adding more hot water gradually, until the pitcher was nearly full and the surface was covered with a thick layer of pale brown foam. The monk poured the liquid from the pitcher into the cup. The stream was dark and glossy, catching the light from the window. The foam settled on top a soft cushion that looked almost like the head on a mug of ale. The monk lifted the cup and held it in both hands, feeling the warmth through the thin clay walls. He raised it to his lips and took a small sip, letting the liquid rest on his tongue for a moment before swallowing. The taste was unlike anything the beans had experienced in their long journey. It was the culmination of everything that had come before: the bitterness of the fresh seed, tempered by fermentation and drying, the complexity developed by roasting and grinding, and now the sweetness of sugar and the warmth of spices, all brought together by the simple addition of hot water. It was rich and smooth and deeply satisfying. It was chocolate. The monk drank the cup slowly, savoring each sip. When he was finished, he set the empty cup on the table and wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. He looked at the remaining paste in the bowl and at the beans that still waited in the crate. There was much work still to be done. The paste could be stored for a time, rolled into small cakes or tablets that would harden as they cooled and could be dissolved in hot water later. Some of the beans would be ground fresh each day, and some would be saved for special occasions. But for now, the monk was content. He had completed the transformation that had begun so long ago in a humid forest on the other side of the world. He rose from the cushion and stretched his back. He walked to the window and looked out at the courtyard garden, where the afternoon light was beginning to soften toward evening. A few leaves stirred in a gentle breeze. A bird landed on the edge of the stone fountain and then flew away. The monk turned back to the kitchen and began to clean the metates and the molinillo, and the cups, wiping away the dark residue with a damp cloth. The water in the cloth turned brown and then clear as he rinsed it in the cistern. He set the tools on a rack to dry, and then he covered the bowl of paste with a clean cloth. The kitchen grew quiet again. The fire in the hearth had burned down to a bed of glowing coals that cast a soft orange light across the stone floor. The shadows in the corners deepened as the daylight faded. The beans in the crate sat silently on the table, their journey now complete in one sense, that they would continue to be used and transformed for many months to come. They had traveled from a forest pod to a monastery kitchen, crossing oceans and centuries in the process. They had been fermented and dried and counted and shipped and roasted and ground. They had met sugar and cinnamon and vanilla. They had become something entirely new. The monk left the kitchen and walked down a stone corridor, his sandals making a soft slapping sound on the worn tiles. The door closed behind him, and the kitchen was left in the quiet dusk, with only the faint glow of the coals and the lingering scent of chocolate hanging in the still air. Outside the window, the courtyard garden grew dark, and the first stars began to appear in the pale evening sky. The beans rested in their crate, dreaming of nothing, waiting for the next morning, when the monk would return and the quiet work would begin again. The room was quiet, and the light was grey. It came through a tall window set into a wall of pale panelled wood, the colour of old honey. The window was divided into many small panes by thin lead lines, and the glass itself was imperfect, with faint ripples and tiny bubbles that caught the light and held it. Outside the window, a garden stretched away into the afternoon mist, a formal arrangement of low hedges and gravel paths and stone urns that held the bare stems of last season's roses. The garden was still and silent, as if it too were waiting for something that would not arrive. Inside the room, a fire burned in a small grate. The fire was not large or roaring, but a modest arrangement of coals and a single log that glowed a steady orange and released an occasional soft crackle. The sound was so familiar and so constant that it had become a kind of silence itself, a gentle rhythm that filled the space without disturbing it. The fire cast a warm light across the polished wooden floor and sent shadows dancing slowly on the walls. But its warmth did not reach the far corners of the room where the grey light from the window held sway. The room contained a few pieces of furniture, each one placed with care. There was a tall clock in the corner, its brass pendulum swinging with a soft tick that marked the seconds without urgency. There was a cabinet of dark carved wood, with glass doors behind which a few leather-bound books stood in a row, their spines faded to shades of brown and burgundy. There was a tapestry on one wall showing a scene of trees and a distant hill worked in threads of green and blue and gold that had softened with age. And in the centre of the room near the fire there was a small round table of polished walnut, on which rested a single porcelain cup. The cup was small and delicate. its walls thin enough that the light from the fire seemed to glow through them. The porcelain was white, a pure soft white like fresh cream or the inner petals of a gardenia. Around the rim and down one side ran a pattern painted in cobalt blue, a scene of a willow tree, bending over a small bridge and two figures crossing the bridge in quiet companionship. The blue was deep and rich, having been fired into the glaze so that it would never fade or wear away. The cup sat on a matching saucer, also white and blue, its surface reflecting the flicker of the firelight in tiny bright points. Inside the cup was the liquid. It was dark brown, nearly black, with a faint oily sheen on its surface where the fat from the ground beans had risen and spread. A thin curl of steam rose from the cup, straight up into the still air where it dissipated slowly into the grey light. The steam carried a scent that filled the room without overwhelming it, a scent that was warm and complex with notes of roasted nuts and dark earth and a faint floral sweetness that came from the vanilla that had been added to the paste. The scent hung in the air like a quiet promise of warmth and comfort. Beside the cup on the saucer rested a small silver spoon. The spoon was plain and unadorned, its bowl worn thin at the edge from years of use. The handle was smooth and slightly bent where countless fingers had held it. The spoon had been used to stir the liquid moments before, and a few drops of the dark drink still clung to its bowl, catching the light like tiny jewels. The stirring had been slow and gentle, a circular motion that had dissolved the last grains of sugar that had settled at the bottom of the cup. Now the spoon lay still, and the liquid in the cup was calm, its surface barely disturbed by the fading motion of the stir. The room was occupied by a single person who sat in a high-backed chair upholstered in faded velvet, the color of dried moss. The person was still and quiet, their hands wrapped around the warmth of the porcelain cup. The cup was small enough that both hands could hold it comfortably, fingers interlaced around its curved sides. The heat from the liquid seeped through the thin walls of the porcelain and into the palms and fingers, a gentle, penetrating warmth that seemed to spread up through the wrists and into the arms. It was a simple pleasure, one of the few that required nothing but stillness and attention. The person raised the cup slowly toward their face. The motion was unhurried, as if time itself had slowed to match the rhythm of the room. The cup approached the lips and tilted just enough for a small amount of the dark liquid to flow into the mouth. The taste was rich and smooth, slightly bitter with an undercurrent of sweetness that lingered after the liquid was swallowed. The warmth spread down the throat and into the chest, a sensation of comfort that required no thought or analysis. The person lowered the cup back to the resting position between their hands and sat quietly, allowing the taste to fade slowly from their tongue. Outside the window, the grey light continued to shift as the afternoon wore on. A cloud passed over the pale sun, and the room dimmed slightly, then brightened again as the cloud moved on. The fire crackled softly, and a small shower of sparks rose from the log and vanished up the chimney. The pendulum of the tall clock swung back and forth its tick, a steady presence that measured time without demanding that anyone pay attention to it. The person in the chair did not look at the clock. There was nowhere to be, and nothing to do except to sit and hold the warm cup and watch the steam rise. The cup was not the only one of its kind. Somewhere in the house there were others, matching cups and saucers, and a pot with the same blue willow pattern stored in a cabinet lined with felt. They were brought out on special occasions when visitors came and sat in this same room and drank the same dark liquid from the same delicate cups. But today there were no visitors. Today there was only the single cup and the single person and the quiet grey light of a late autumn afternoon. The drink in the cup was the culmination of a journey that had begun long ago and far away. The beans that had been ground into the paste had travelled across an ocean in the hold of a ship. They had been roasted and ground on a stone metate in a monastery kitchen. They had been mixed with sugar from distant islands, and vanilla from dark forest vines, and cinnamon from the bark of trees that grew on far hillsides. All of these things had come together in this small cup of warm liquid, a convergence of distances and labours that the person holding the cup would never fully know. The person knew only that the drink was warm and good, and that it made the quiet afternoon feel a little less empty. The level of liquid in the cup lowered slowly as the minutes passed. Each sip was small and deliberate, taken only when the previous sip had been fully savoured and allowed to fade. The warmth of the cup in the hands began to diminish as the volume of hot liquid decreased. The thin porcelain no longer held the heat as effectively, and the person's fingers registered the gradual cooling. It was a slow change, a gentle decline that matched the fading of the light outside the window. When the cup was nearly empty, the person tilted it further to gather the last few drops. The dregs were thicker than the rest of the liquid, containing fine particles of ground bean that had not fully dissolved. These particles left a faint gritty texture on the tongue, a reminder of the solid form from which the drink had come. The person swallowed the last of the liquid and set the cup back on its saucer. The sound of porcelain meeting porcelain was a soft, clear click that hung in the quiet air for a moment and then faded. The cup was empty now except for a thin, dark sediment that coated the bottom and lower sides in a fine film. The sediment was the color of wet earth or old wood, the same color that the beans had been when they lay drying on the woven mat in the forest clearing. It formed a pattern on the white porcelain, a random distribution of tiny particles that had settled as the liquid cooled. The pattern was meaningless but beautiful in its way, like the shapes of clouds or the grain of wood. The person looked down at the empty cup for a long moment. Then they lifted the small silver spoon from the saucer and used it to scrape a tiny amount of the sediment from the bottom of the cup. The sediment was soft and slightly sticky, having absorbed the last of the moisture. The person raised the spoon to their lips and tasted the sediment, letting it dissolve slowly on the tongue. The flavor was more intense than the drink itself, concentrated and pure, with a bitterness that was not unpleasant, and an earthiness that spoke of soil and rain and the slow, patient work of fermentation. It was the essence of the bean, the thing that remained when everything else had been extracted. The person set the spoon down and leaned back in the chair. The hands that had held the cup now rested on the arms of the chair, palms upturned and empty. The warmth that had filled the chest from the hot drink was fading, now replaced by a comfortable neutrality, a state of quiet equilibrium that asked nothing and expected nothing. The room was still, and the fire was still, and the grey light from the window continued its slow fade toward evening. Outside the window the garden had grown dimmer. The shapes of the hedges and the stone urns were softer, now their edges blurred by the gathering dusk. A single bird flew across the pale sky, visible for only a moment before disappearing beyond the roofline. No sound came from the garden. The gravel paths were empty, and the bare rose stems stood motionless in the cool air. The clock in the corner continued its steady tick. The pendulum swung, and the hands crept forward, measuring time in increments so small that they could not be perceived. The fire settled with a soft sigh, and the log shifted, sending another small shower of sparks up the chimney. The person in the chair did not move. Their eyes were half closed, not in sleep, but in a state of restful awareness that hovered between waking and dreaming. The empty cup sat on the table, a small white circle in the gathering dimness. The blue willow pattern was still visible, a darker blue against the pale porcelain. The bridge and the tree and the two small figures continued their quiet journey across the surface of the cup, as they had done for years, and would continue to do for years to come. The sediment at the bottom of the cup dried slowly, turning from a dark wet film to a lighter powdery residue that would later be rinsed away with water and a cloth. The ritual was complete. The bean had been transformed from a bitter purple seed into a warm brown drink, and that drink had been consumed, and now only the memory of its warmth remained. The journey that had begun in a humid forest grove, and passed through fermentation piles and drying mats and counting plazas and shipholds and monastery kitchens, had reached its quiet end in this still room on a grey afternoon. There was no fanfare and no conclusion, only the slow settling of the day into evening and the peaceful emptiness of a cup that had served its purpose. The person in the chair stirred slightly. They reached out and picked up the empty cup and saucer, holding them together in one hand, while the other hand pushed against the arm of the chair to rise. The motion was slow and careful, the kind of motion made by someone who has learned to move without disturbing the quiet around them. They carried the cup and saucer across the room to a small side table, where a pitcher of water and a cloth waited. The cup was rinsed with a small amount of water, swirled gently to lift the dried sediment, and then emptied into a small bowl. The saucer was wiped clean with the cloth. Both were set aside to dry. The person walked back to the chair and sat down again. The fire had burned lower now, its glow reduced to a soft orange pulse among the ashes. The room was nearly dark, the grey light from the window having faded to a deep twilight blue. The person did not light a candle. They sat in the growing darkness, listening to the tick of the clock and the occasional crackle of the dying fire and the profound silence of the house around them. The cup was empty. The drink was gone. The afternoon had passed, and still the room held its quiet, the kind of quiet that comes after something has been completed and before anything new has begun. It was a waiting quiet, a patient quiet that asked for nothing and offered nothing except the simple peace of being still. Somewhere far away, in a place that the person in the chair would never see, a cacao tree was producing new flowers, tiny pinkish white stars against rough grey bark. Some of those flowers would become pods, and some of those pods would fall and split, and their beans would begin the long journey that had just ended in this room. The cycle would continue, as it always had and always would. But for now, in this moment, there was only the empty cup and the quiet room and the slow, steady breathing of someone who had drunk their chocolate and was content to sit in the darkness and let the evening come. The cup was empty, and the grounds remained. They clung to the bottom and sides of the porcelain cup in a thin, dark film that had dried during the quiet evening hours. The next morning, when the grey light returned to the room, a hand lifted the cup from the side table and carried it through a narrow door into a small scullery where water waited in a stone basin. The cup was rinsed, and the dark sediment loosened and swirled away into a bucket that sat beneath the basin. The water in the bucket turned a pale brown as the grounds dispersed through it, a cloud of tiny particles that drifted and settled slowly. Later that day, the bucket was lifted and carried outside. The person who carried it walked through a door at the back of the house and into a walled garden where the air was cool and damp and smelled of wet earth and decaying leaves. The garden was small and enclosed on 3 sides by old brick walls covered with patches of moss and the bare stems of climbing roses. The 4th side was open to a view of a sloping field that led down to a line of trees, and beyond that a distant church spire barely visible through the morning mist. The garden was quiet except for the sound of a single robin singing from the top of the wall and the soft crunch of gravel underfoot. In one corner of the garden there was a heap. It was not a neat pile, but a low-spreading mound of organic matter, leaves and grass clippings and vegetable peelings and the withered stems of last season's flowers, all layered together in a dark mass that had been accumulating for many months. The heap sat directly on the bare earth, and it was surrounded by a simple frame of rough wooden stakes and chicken wire that kept it contained but allowed air and moisture to move freely through. The surface of the heap was uneven, with some parts fresher and greener, and other parts older and darker where decomposition had already done its work. The person stopped beside the heap and tilted the bucket. The brown water spilled out in a slow arc, splashing onto the surface of the pile and running down into the crevices between the leaves and stems. The grounds that had been suspended in the water were deposited onto the heap, a fine dark dust that clung to the wet surfaces and then began to soak inward. The person set the empty bucket down and stood for a moment looking at the heap. A thin wisp of steam rose from its center, where the internal warmth of decomposition met the cool morning air. The person turned and walked back toward the house, leaving the heap to its quiet work. The grounds settled into their new home. They were no longer beans and no longer paste and no longer drink. They were now a fine dark powder composed of the insoluble remnants of the roasted and ground cotyledons, the cellulose fibers and the trace minerals that had been drawn up from the forest soil by the roots of the cacao tree so long ago. These particles were tiny, smaller than the finest sand, and they filtered down through the layers of the heap carried by the moisture of the spilled water. Some of them came to rest on the surface of a decaying oak leaf, others lodged between the fibers of a wilted cabbage leaf. Still others sank deeper, finding their way into the dark interior of the pile where the heat was greatest and the decomposition was most active. The heap was a living place, though, not in the way that a forest is living. It was home to billions of tiny organisms that could not be seen by human eyes. There were bacteria of many kinds, each one specialized to break down a particular type of organic matter. There were fungi whose fine white threads, called hyphae, wove through the decaying material like a delicate web. There were tiny nematodes and springtails and mites that fed on the bacteria and fungi and on each other. And there were earthworms, pale pink creatures that burrowed through the heap, consuming the decaying matter and excreting it as rich, dark castings that would become soil. The grounds from the chocolate cup joined this quiet community. The cellulose fibers that had once formed the cell walls of the cacao cotyledons were slowly attacked by bacteria that could digest this tough material. The bacteria secreted enzymes that broke the long cellulose chains into smaller sugar molecules, which the bacteria then absorbed for their own growth and energy. As they fed and multiplied, they released carbon dioxide and water and heat. The heat added to the warmth of the heap, maintaining the temperature that favored further decomposition. The fungi found the grounds as well. Their fine white hyphae grew into the dark powder, seeking out the remaining nutrients that the bacteria had not consumed. The fungi were patient and thorough, spreading their network through the heap and connecting different parts of it into a single living system. Through this network, nutrients could travel from one place to another, moving from areas of abundance to areas of scarcity. The grounds from the cacao bean contributed their small share of nitrogen and phosphorus and potassium, the elements that plants need to grow. These elements had been gathered by the cacao tree from the forest soil, and now they were being returned to the soil of another continent entirely. The earthworms encountered the grounds as they burrowed through the heap. The worms did not seek out the grounds specifically. They simply consumed whatever organic matter lay in their path, grinding it in their gizzards with the help of small particles of sand and stone. The grounds passed through the worms and emerged as part of the dark, crumbly castings that the worms deposited behind them. In this form, the remnants of the cacao bean were no longer recognizable as anything distinct. They had become part of the general fertility of the heap, part of the slow transformation of waste into soil. Rain fell on the garden. It came as a soft, steady drizzle that lasted for hours, pattering on the leaves of the heap and soaking down into its interior. The moisture carried dissolved nutrients deeper into the pile and then out through the bottom where they seeped into the actual earth beneath. The roots of the plants growing near the heap, the roses on the wall and the herbs in the nearby beds reached toward this seepage, drawing up the water and the dissolved nutrients. The elements that had once been part of a cacao bean were taken up by the roots of a rosemary bush and incorporated into its fragrant needle-like leaves. Another portion found its way into the roots of a lavender plant and eventually into its pale purple flowers. The bean had become part of the garden. The heap continued its slow transformation through the seasons. In the autumn, more leaves were added, brown and gold and red, drifting down from the trees beyond the garden wall. In the winter, the heap lay dormant under a thin crust of frost, its internal warmth barely sufficient to keep the center from freezing. In the spring, new green clippings were added, fresh grass from the first mowing of the lawn and the pruned stems of the roses. The heap absorbed all of these things and continued its quiet work. The grounds from the chocolate cup were no longer distinguishable. They had been completely incorporated into the dark, crumbly mass that was forming at the bottom of the heap. This mass was no longer a collection of separate things, but a unified substance, a rich, loamy material that smelled of forests and rain and the deep earth. It was soil, new soil created from the remnants of many lives. One spring morning, the person who had emptied the bucket returned to the heap with a garden fork. The fork was old and worn, its wooden handle smooth from years of use, and its iron tines darkened to a dull grey. The person inserted the fork into the base of the heap and lifted, turning the outer layers inward and exposing the dark interior. The material that came up on the fork was different from the material on the surface. It was darker, richer, and more uniform, with a fine, crumbly texture that broke apart easily. It smelled sweet and earthy, a smell that spoke of completion and readiness. The person filled a wooden barrow with this dark soil and wheeled it across the garden to a bed where new seedlings waited. The seedlings were small and green, their tender stems barely thicker than a thread. The person dug small holes with a trowel and placed the seedlings into them, then filled the holes with the dark soil from the heap, pressing it gently around the roots. The seedlings would grow in this soil, drawing up the nutrients that it contained. The remnants of the cacao bean would become part of the stems and leaves and flowers of these new plants, just as they had become part of the rosemary and the lavender. The heap itself continued to exist. New material was added to the top, while the finished soil was removed from the bottom. The process was continuous and unending, a slow cycle that turned waste into life. The grounds from the chocolate cup had played their small part in this cycle, and then moved on, becoming something else. Becoming soil, becoming plants, becoming the fabric of the garden. The walled garden was quiet in the afternoon sun. The robin that had sung from the top of the wall was gone, now replaced by a pair of sparrows that flitted among the rose stems. The herbs in their beds released their fragrances when the breeze stirred rosemary and thyme and sage, mingling together into a scent that was both sharp and soothing. The heap sat in its corner, a dark mound of potential slowly transforming under the patient attention of the unseen billions that lived within it. Somewhere beneath the surface, in a place that no eye would ever see, a tiny particle that had once been part of a cacao bean rested against a grain of sand that had once been part of a mountain. The two particles had come from different worlds and different times, but here in the quiet dark of the garden soil they lay side by side, indistinguishable from each other. The bean had completed its journey. It had traveled from forest to fermentation to drying mat to canoe to plaza to ship hold to monastery kitchen to porcelain cup, and finally to this quiet heap in a walled garden. It had been seed and currency and cargo and paste and drink, and now it was soil. The cycle would begin again. Somewhere in the world, new cacao pods were ripening on rough-barked trees. New beans were being fermented under banana leaves. New sacks were being loaded into canoes on placid lakes. The journey that had ended here in this garden was being repeated countless times in countless places, a continuous flow of seeds moving from forest to cup to soil and back again. The bean did not know this, and the person in the garden did not think of it. They simply worked the soil with their hands, planting and watering, and waiting for the seeds they had placed in the ground to grow. The afternoon wore on, and the shadows lengthened across the garden. The sparrows finished their business and flew away over the wall. A single bee hummed among the lavender flowers, its body dusted with pale pollen. The heap sat undisturbed, its surface warming in the sun, and its interior continuing its slow, patient transformation. The grounds that had once been a cacao bean were now part of something larger, part of the soil that would feed the garden for years to come. The person finished their work and stood up, brushing the dark soil from their hands. They looked across the garden at the neat rows of seedlings and the blooming herbs and the old brick walls with their covering of moss. The garden was a quiet place, a place of slow growth and patient waiting. It asked for nothing except attention and time. The person turned and walked back toward the house, leaving the garden to the afternoon sun, and the bees and the quiet work of the soil. The door closed and the garden was alone. The heap sat in its corner, breathing out its faint warmth. The particles that had been a cacao bean rested in the darkness, doing nothing, becoming nothing, simply existing as part of the earth. The journey was over. The bean had returned to the ground from which all things come and to which all things eventually go. And in the quiet of the walled garden, with the sound of the distant church bell tolling the hour across the fields, there was only peace and stillness and the slow turning of the world.